The master's records at Casterly Rock would later note, with the particular caution of men who understood that written words outlive the powerful, that the birth of Tyrion Lannister on the 14th day of the third moon of 267 AC was among the most dangerous moments in the history of House Lannister. Not because of the child, though the child was dangerous enough in his way, but because of what nearly happened to the mother. Joanna Lannister did not die. This fact, unremarkable on its surface, would in time prove to be the hinge upon which the history of an entire continent turned. The labor had been catastrophic. 3 maesters attended, and 2 of them privately wrote in their personal correspondence that they did not expect Lady Joanna to survive the night. The infant was malformed, short-limbed, mismatched eyes, a face that the servants would later describe in whispers that carried the particular cruelty of people who serve the powerful and resent them for it. Tywin Lannister stood outside the chamber door for 9 hours. Men who witnessed it said they had never seen him stand so still. He did not pray. Tywin Lannister had never been a man who believed the gods listened to lions. But he stood, and he waited. And when the master finally opened the door, with a face arranged into cautious relief, Tywin walked past him without a word, and sat beside his wife and took her hand with a gentleness that none of them, not the servants, not the maesters, not the guards, ever spoke of publicly, because they understood instinctively that to speak of it was to invite the kind of attention that ended careers and sometimes lives. Joanna lived. She was weakened for months. There would be no more children. The maesters were clear on this, and Tywin received the information with the same stillness he had maintained outside the chamber door. 3 children, an heir in Jaime, golden and beloved, a daughter in Cersei, sharp and beautiful, and now this Tyrion, this small and startling thing that the gods had apparently decided to send as either punishment or joke. The lords of the Rock whispered. The servants whispered louder. Joanna Lannister heard every whisper in the way that intelligent women in positions of constrained power always hear everything, and she made her calculations accordingly. She did not coddle Tyrion. Joanna was a Lannister by birth as well as marriage. A cousin to Tywin, raised in the same cold halls, educated in the same unsentimental tradition. Once she understood that coddling a child in Westeros was a form of cruelty dressed as kindness. What she did instead was subtler and more durable. She ensured that Tyrion's access to the Rock's library was unlimited. She arranged for the best tutors the Westerlands could provide. When servants spoke unkindly within earshot, they found themselves reassigned to tasks that represented a significant diminishment of their circumstances. And when Tywin, who in those early years looked at his youngest son with an expression that even Joanna could not fully decode, somewhere between grief and guilt and something colder. When Tywin made to speak of Tyrion in terms that reduced him, Joanna would redirect the conversation with the particular skill of a woman who had spent 20 years learning exactly which levers moved her husband. And this was not softness, it was strategy. And it worked because Joanna was the only person in Westeros whom Tywin Lannister genuinely could not bring himself to disappoint. If you want to see more stories exploring Westeros's greatest turning points, hit that subscribe button and drop the scenario you'd want explored in the comments below. All men must die, but legends endure. Cersei grew up differently too, though the changes in her were slower and more complicated. In the history that might have been, the one where her mother bled out on a cold stone floor while a malformed infant screamed, Cersei Lannister calcified around an absence. She became a woman shaped by grief she couldn't name and rage she couldn't justify, who loved her father's strength because it was the only love available, who looked at Tyrion and saw the thing that had taken her mother, who wanted power because power was the only protection a woman in Westeros could reach for. That Cersei was brilliant and dangerous and ultimately tragic, a lioness pacing a cage of her own partly chosen construction. This Cersei had a mother. It did not make her gentle. The Cersei Lannister of this history was still ambitious, still sharp, still possessed of the particular intelligence that the Lannister line reliably produced. But her ambitions were differently shaped. She had someone to argue with, genuinely argue with, not the performative counsel of men who deferred to her father and humored her. Joanna did not humor Cersei. She pushed back. She questioned. So she sat with her daughter in the candlelit evenings at Casterly Rock and asked uncomfortable questions about what Cersei wanted and why she wanted it, and whether she had considered what it would cost. Cersei found these conversations infuriating and could not stop seeking them out. This was, though she would never have articulated it in these terms, what having a mother meant. Jaime remained the golden one. Jaime always would be. That was simply what Jaime was. The boy who had been born perfect and knew it with the easy confidence of someone who had never been required to doubt themselves. But Joanna's presence meant that Jaime's golden certainty was regularly punctured by a woman who loved him completely and refused to let that love excuse his laziness. He trained harder. He read more. He was still the most naturally gifted swordsman of his generation, but he was also, in this history, slightly less certain that natural gifts were sufficient. This small difference would matter later, in ways that cascaded. The rock hummed with a different energy than it had in years when Joanna was well enough to walk its halls again. Tywin did not become a different man. Tywin Lannister was not a man who became different things. He was a man who had forged himself into a specific shape in early life and maintained that shape through sheer force of will. But he became a man who occasionally paused before acting. A man who, when contemplating a particularly cold solution to a political problem, could hear his wife's voice in the corridor and find himself inexplicably considering whether there was another way. And he almost always concluded there wasn't, but the pause existed, and pauses in the machinery of power are everything. The year 277 AC brought the defiance of Duskendale. In the history that was, Tywin Lannister, grieving, hardened, with nothing left to lose and only legacy to protect, laid siege to the city with absolute patience and absolute ruthlessness. Lord Darkland was executed along with every member of his family who could be construed as complicit. The lesson was final and brutal. In this history, Joanna sat with Tywin the evening before the decision was made and asked him, with the particular precision she had spent 2 decades developing, whether executing the Darkland line entirely served the lesson he wanted taught, or whether a more targeted punishment would achieve the same deterrence at less cost in future loyalty. And Tywin executed Lord Darkland and his immediate conspirators. The rest of the family was stripped of title and wealth and sent to the wall or the faith. It was still brutal, but 3 Darkland cousins survived, and their survival meant 3 families in the Crownlands who owed the Lannisters a complicated debt that would, 15 years later, prove unexpectedly useful. Joanna Lannister did not save lives through sentiment. She saved them through arithmetic, and Tywin respected arithmetic above almost everything. The decade between Duskendale and Robert's Rebellion passed in the way that almost peaceful decades pass in Westeros, with the grinding of political machinery, the careful arrangement of marriages and alliances, the slow accumulation of grievances that would eventually require payment in blood. Joanna watched it all. She received the Rock's correspondence with the interest of a woman who understood that information was the only currency that never devalued. She wrote her own letters, careful, warm in tone, precise in content, to ladies across the 7 kingdoms who were wives and mothers to powerful men, and who therefore knew things their husbands didn't know they knew. By the time the dragons of House Targaryen began to flicker with madness, by the time Aerys II started making decisions that even his most loyal supporters cataloged in private with growing alarm, Joanna Lannister had built the most sophisticated informal intelligence network in Westeros. It had no name. It left almost no documentary evidence. It consisted primarily of letters between noblewomen about children and harvests and the particular health concerns of aging lords. It was, Varys would later reflect, with something approaching genuine admiration, more effective than anything he had constructed in his first years at court. When the ravens began to fly in 282 AC, when Lyanna Stark disappeared and Brandon Stark rode to King's Landing demanding justice and found instead a pyre, Joanna Lannister was already 3 moves ahead of the war that everyone else was only beginning to see coming. The ravens arrived at Casterly Rock on a gray morning in the 3rd moon of 282 AC, and Joanna Lannister read them before Tywin did. This was not accident. It was arrangement. The master who managed the rock's correspondence had learned, over 14 years of careful observation, that Lady Joanna's instructions arrived with the quiet authority of someone who did not need to raise her voice to be understood, and that following those instructions produced better outcomes for the rock, for the family, and for his own continued comfortable position than following anyone else's. He brought the ravens to her solar first. He always had. Tywin either did not know or had decided the efficiency justified the protocol breach. With Tywin, the two possibilities were often indistinguishable. She read the accounts of Brandon Stark's ride to King's Landing twice. She read Aerys's response, the arrest, the imprisonment, the summons to Lord Rickard. Once because once was sufficient. Then she sat for a long moment in the pale morning light that came through the rock's western windows, watching the sea far below. When and she thought with the particular clarity that she had always been able to find in moments when other people's minds were clouding with emotion. Tywin had resigned as Hand of the King 4 years prior, in a rupture with Aerys that had been building for a decade. The Mad King's humiliations had accumulated past the point where even Tywin's cold pride could absorb them. Aerys's treatment of Joanna herself at the tourney at Lannisport had been the ignition point, though the fuel had been building long before. Tywin had retreated to Casterly Rock with the controlled fury of a man who intended to wait, accumulate strength, and respond at the moment of maximum advantage. This patience was genuine. It was also, Joanna had always understood, profoundly dangerous. Because Tywin's patience was not the patience of a man who had made peace with delay. It was the patience of a siege engine being winched back. She was in his solar before he had finished breakfast. "Brandon Stark is dead," she said, setting the relevant correspondence in front of him. "Or will be within days. Rickard Stark has been summoned and will follow him. Aerys intends to make an example." Tywin read. His face did not change. This was, Joanna had learned in 20 years of marriage, the most dangerous version of her husband. Not the cold fury, not the deliberate cruelty, but the absolute stillness that preceded a decision already made. "Robert Baratheon will rebel," he said. "Yes. Jon Arryn will support him. The Tullys will follow. Lyanna Stark was promised to Robert, and Catelyn Tully is already wed to Eddard Stark. The North and the Vale and the Riverlands at minimum." "Yes," Joanna said again. She sat down across from him, which she was the only person in Westeros who did without waiting for invitation. "And you will receive a raven from Aerys within a fortnight demanding the Rock's armies march for the crown." "And another from Robert Baratheon," Tywin said, "asking me to declare." "Yes." He looked at her. This was the conversation he would not have had with any other living person. Not because he lacked advisors, but because advisors told you what they believed you wanted to hear, or what they believed was strategically optimal. And both categories of counsel suffered from the fundamental deficiency of not knowing Tywin Lannister well enough to tell him what was actually true. Joanna told him what was actually true. And this had occasionally been deeply unpleasant for both of them. It had also, over 20 years, built the only relationship Tywin had ever had that he trusted without qualification. "Tell me what you see," he said. Joanna folded her hands on the desk. Outside, the sea moved against the rock in long, slow rhythms. "I see a mad king who has made himself everyone's enemy and retained none of the tools that might have let him survive it. I see a rebellion that will succeed. The numbers and the commanders favor it, and Aerys has driven away every competent man who might have saved him." She paused. "I see a moment that comes once in a generation, if that. The shape of Westeros is about to be reforged. The only question is who holds the hammer." "Robert Baratheon is a hammer," Tywin said. "He'll win the war and struggle with the peace. Which is why the hand of the king will matter more than the king." Tywin was quiet. The fire in the Solar's hearth settled with a soft collapse of wood. "You're suggesting we wait." "I'm suggesting we move at precisely the right moment," Joanna said. "Not for Aerys. Not at Robert's first invitation, which will make us appear eager and reduce our leverage. We wait until the battle is won, or nearly won, and then we ride for King's Landing." She met his eyes steadily. "And when we arrive, we do not sack the city." The stillness again. "Aerys will burn it." Eris will try, which is why Jaime needs different orders than Eris will give him. This was the moment. Joanna had thought about it carefully since reading The Ravens, reworking through the variables with the same methodical attention she brought to everything that mattered. Jaime was 17 and serving in the King's Guard, sworn to protect a king who was losing his mind in the specific direction of wildfire and screaming. In the history that might have been, Jaime Lannister had faced that moment alone. A 17-year-old boy with no guidance and an impossible choice, who made the right decision and spent the rest of his life wearing it as a brand. Kingslayer, a title that contained a truth no one wanted to examine too carefully. But in this history, Jaime had a mother who had been corresponding with him. Not about rebellion. Joanna was too careful for explicit instruction in a letter that could be intercepted. But she had written to her son about duty and its layers, about the oath to the king and the oath to the realm, and how a king's guard served both simultaneously, and what a knight of genuine honor did when those two oaths pointed in different directions. She had written about legacy. She had written about the kind of man she hoped he was becoming. And between those careful lines, for a son who had his mother's intelligence and his father's strategic mind, the message was clear enough. When the moment came, when Eris began screaming for his pyromancers, and the wildfire caches beneath King's Landing stirred with terrible potential, Jaime Lannister did not hesitate as long as he might have. He had already in some private interior place made his peace with the choice. The king died cleanly, which was more than he deserved. The pyromancer died before he could light the first cache, and Jaime Lannister sat on the Iron Throne with the specific expression of a man who knows exactly what he has done and has decided to own it, and waited for whatever came next. What came next was his father's army riding through the gates of King's Landing. Not to sack it, but to secure it. Joanna had given Tywin the same layered instruction she had given Jaime. The gold cloaks were offered terms before swords were drawn. The city's granaries and wells were secured rather than torched. The Red Keep's servants and small folk were guaranteed safety provided they remained in their quarters. There was violence. There is always violence when armies enter cities, and Tywin Lannister was not a man who traded in comfortable fictions about soldiers' behavior. But it was targeted violence, disciplined violence, the violence of a force with clear objectives rather than the chaos of a sacking. King's Landing stood largely intact when Robert Baratheon rode through the gates. This fact would shape everything that followed, though Robert himself barely noticed it in his grief over Lyanna. The city's survival meant that the small folks' first memory of Lannister power was not rape and burning. It meant that the sept stood and the market stood, and the various mechanisms of urban life resumed within days rather than months. It meant that the new king inherited a functioning capital rather than a traumatized ruin, and it meant that Tywin Lannister arrived at Robert's court not carrying the invisible weight of a sack, not needing to justify what his men had done. He arrived as the man who had held the city together. Joanna came to King's Landing 3 weeks after the city was secured, when the Ravens confirmed it was safe, and the political situation had clarified sufficiently to make her presence useful rather than merely symbolic. She rode with a retinue of 40, modest enough not to appear threatening, substantial enough to announce that she was not arriving as a supplicant. She met Eddard Stark on her second day at court. He was 23 years old, gray-eyed, with the Norse particular quality of stillness, a different stillness than Tywin's, warmer at its core, rooted in something that resembled genuine integrity rather than the performance of it. He was also, Joanna assessed within the first hour of their conversation, deeply suspicious of everything the Lannisters represented, which was both politically inconvenient and personally understandable given recent history. "Lord Stark," she said, at the small dinner Cersei had organized. Cersei was now betrothed to Robert, which Joanna had complex feelings about that she was carefully keeping to herself. "I understand you have concerns about the circumstances of the city's taking." Ned Stark looked at her with the directness of a man who had not yet learned to disguise his assessments. "I have concerns about Jaime Lannister sitting on the Iron Throne when we arrived, my lady." "A reasonable concern," Joanna said. "He had just killed the king he was sworn to protect. I imagine the image was striking." "He was smiling," Ned said, And the particular quality of his disapproval was so northern, so rooted in a code that didn't account for impossible choices, that Joanna almost felt a flash of genuine affection for him. He was relieved, she said quietly. There is a difference, Lord Stark. Though I grant you they can look similar from the doorway. She let that sit for a moment. My son killed a man who was about to burn 500,000 people alive, with wildfire cached beneath this city. He made that choice alone, at 17, without guidance or support, in the service of people who will never know his name. She picked up her wine cup. I am not asking you to give him a parade. I am asking you to consider the possibility that the situation was more complicated than the position of the body suggested. Ned Stark did not become Jaime's defender. He was never going to become Jaime's defender. He was constitutionally incapable of it, and Joanna was not naive enough to expect transformation in a single dinner conversation. But he became slightly less certain in his condemnation, which was all she needed. A crack in absolute judgment was sufficient. She could work with cracks. She was going to need to work with many of them in the years ahead. The war was over. The political work, the harder, longer, more dangerous work, was just beginning. Cersei was going to be queen. Joanna looked at her daughter across the dinner table, catching Cersei's eye for a brief moment. And in that moment passed between them the particular communication of women who understand each other completely and know that understanding is both gift and burden. They would need to talk, at length, soon. Anu, the lion's den that was King's Landing, had just acquired 2 lionesses, and Westeros had not yet begun to appreciate what that meant. The court of King Robert Baratheon was, in its early years, a thing of genuine vitality slowly curdling into disappointment. Robert himself was the problem, in the way that great men who win great wars are often the problem. He had been forged for conflict and had no reliable shape in its absence. He drank with the enthusiasm of a man medicating a grief he would not name. He hunted with the desperation of someone who needed to be moving, or the stillness would become unbearable. He took mistresses with the casual frequency of a king who understood that no one would stop him, and he was correct about this, and it made him worse. The small council met and managed the realm around him the way servants quietly rearrange a room around a sleeping lord, carefully, efficiently, and with the constant awareness that he might wake at any moment and overturn everything. Joanna Lannister watched all of this with the patient attention of a woman who had spent years studying how power actually moved versus how it appeared to move, and she drew her conclusions accordingly. The hand of the king in those first years was Jon Arryn, a decent man, a genuinely decent man, which in King's Landing was its own form of liability. He managed Robert's excesses with the weary competence of a foster father who had never quite stopped feeling responsible for the boy. He was also aging, and the city's particular combination of damp cold and political stress was not improving his health. Joanna noted this. She noted everything. Cersei's marriage to Robert had been, from its first week, a transaction that satisfied neither party. Robert wanted Lyanna, who was dead, and had taken Cersei as a political necessity and a beautiful consolation that consoled him not at all. Cersei wanted. Joanna had long, careful conversations with her daughter about what Cersei wanted, and the answer was complicated. Power, yes, always power, but power in service of something. In the history that might have been, that something had curdled into pure self-preservation, into her children and her survival, and the Iron Throne as a fortress against a world that had always made her feel besieged. In this history, Joanna was available to ask the harder question, power in service of what exactly, and was what Cersei was reaching for actually what she wanted? Or was it what she had decided to want because it was the only thing that seemed reachable? These conversations did not transform Cersei. Joanna had no illusions about transformation. People were not clay, and her daughter was emphatically not clay. But they gave Cersei something she had not had in any other version of her life. A witness. Someone who saw her clearly and did not flinch from what they saw and continued to show up anyway. This was not nothing. In Westeros, for a woman in Cersei's position, it was very nearly everything. The Jaime problem required different handling. Jaime had killed the king and saved the city and received as his reward a title that followed him like a shadow, Kingslayer. And the word had weight in Westeros that almost no other insult carried. It touched the sacred compact between a sworn knight and his lord, the foundation upon which the entire feudal structure rested. Never mind the wildfire. Never mind the 500,000 lives. Never mind that Eris had been demonstrably, catastrophically mad. The code said what the code said, and Westeros was a place that preferred the comfort of clear rules to the discomfort of complicated truths. Joanna had anticipated this. She had not been able to prevent it entirely. The story was out, the name was attached, and names in Westeros had a permanence that policy couldn't easily dislodge. What she could do was manage its consequences. She had a quiet conversation with Tywin about Jaime's options, and a separate quiet conversation with Jaime himself. And a third conversation, the most delicate, with Jon Arryn about whether the new regime's foundational narrative might benefit from a slightly more nuanced public account of the Red Keep's final hours. Jon Arryn was a decent man. Decent men were susceptible to arguments grounded in fairness. He could not undo the name Kingslayer, but he could ensure that the official histories being compiled in the Citadel contained a full account of the wildfire discovery. The caches, the pyromancer's orders, the Mad King's explicit command to burn the city. He could ensure that Robert, in his more lucid moments, understood what had actually happened. Robert never became Jaime's champion, but he stopped making the jokes that had begun circulating in the early months, which was progress of a kind. Jaime himself was the real challenge. He had his mother's intelligence and his father's pride, and a specific kind of wound that those two qualities, combined, made particularly difficult to treat. He had done the right thing and been punished for it, and the punishment had confirmed something he had suspected about the world, that it didn't actually want the right thing done. It wanted the appearance of the right thing done, and he had committed the unforgivable sin of making the gap between those two visible. He was funny about it, in the way that deeply hurt people are funny, sardonic, self-deprecating in ways that were actually self-laceration in costume. Joanna sat with him in the Kingsguard's tower on a cold evening 6 months after the war's end, and she said without preamble, and because preamble was for people who had something to protect, "You are going to have to decide whether what you did defines you or whether you define it." Jaime looked at her with the expression he used to conceal the fact that he was listening very carefully. "That sounds like something a Septon says before asking for a donation." "Septons deal in comfort. I'm dealing in accuracy." She looked at her golden son, really looked at him, the way she had always been able to, in a way that he had never been entirely able to deflect. "You saved 400,000 lives, and you will never be thanked for it. That is simply true. The question is what you do with a true thing that's also unfair. And what do you suggest?" "I suggest," Joanna said carefully, "that you become so obviously, not undeniably excellent at everything you do that the name becomes insufficient. Not forgotten. It will never be forgotten. But insufficient. A small word for a large man." She paused. "And I suggest you find something worth being excellent for, beyond the next tournament or the next woman who finds you interesting." Jaime was quiet for a long moment, watching the torches in the courtyard below move in the evening wind. "You sound like you're worried about me." "I'm your mother," Joanna said. "Worrying about you is the only completely irrational thing I do." He almost smiled. It was enough. The small council in those years was its own particular ecosystem of competing interests, and Joanna navigated it with the care of someone crossing a river that looked shallow and wasn't. Where she held no official position. Women did not sit the small council in Westeros, and Joanna was not interested in fighting that particular battle directly when indirect routes were more reliable. What she had instead was access. She attended dinners. She hosted them. She was present at the social occasions that preceded and followed formal meetings, where the real decisions were made in the gaps between the official ones, and she was sufficiently intelligent and sufficiently entertaining that her presence at these occasions was sought rather than merely tolerated. Varys noticed her first, which she had expected. The spider had the particular sensitivity of a man who had survived by detecting threats before they fully formed. Anna in Joanna Lannister, with her network of noble correspondence and her quiet influence over the realm's most powerful lord, registered as a variable that required assessment. He approached her at a feast in the 3rd year of Robert's reign, all soft courtesy and careful eyes. "Lady Joanna," he said, with the particular warmth of a man whose warmth was always slightly too precisely calibrated. "I have heard so much about your wisdom. It is a pleasure to finally have the opportunity to confirm it directly." "Lord Varys," she said, because she had decided early that she would not pretend not to know exactly who and what he was. "I imagine you have heard a great deal about a great many things. It must be very loud inside your head." He blinked, a tiny hesitation, there and gone. You are as perceptive as they say." "I am more perceptive than they say," Joanna said pleasantly. "They say I am Tywin Lannister's clever wife. The modifier does a great deal of work in that description." She looked at him steadily. "I know about your little birds, my lord. I have known for 2 years. I don't find them objectionable. Information is useful, and the realm needs people who gather it carefully. What I find objectionable is the assumption that my correspondence is interesting to you. All correspondence is potentially interesting. Then let me make mine less so." She tilted her head slightly. "I have no designs on the throne. I have no interest in destabilizing the realm. I have considerable interest in my family's position and my grandchildren's futures, in which are best served by a functioning kingdom rather than a burning one. We want the same things, my Lord Varys, or near enough that the differences are not worth the energy of conflict." She picked up her wine. "So let us not waste each other's time with games we're both good enough at to play forever without resolution." Varys looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man genuinely revising his assessment of a situation. "You are," he said finally, with something that seemed fractionally more like actual warmth. "Not what I expected." "No one expects the lioness," Joanna said. "They're always watching the lion." Littlefinger was a different matter. Petter Baelish in those years was not yet the architect of chaos he would become. He was a young man of modest birth and considerable intelligence who had been given the customs of Goldtown as a minor reward for minor services, and who was clearly building towards something larger with the patient intensity of a man who had a great deal to prove to a world that had underestimated him. Joanna recognized the type because she had, in certain important ways, been the type. Someone whose abilities exceeded the position they were permitted to occupy, who had learned to operate in the gaps of other people's assumptions. The difference was what they were building toward. Littlefinger wanted chaos. Not explicitly. He would not have articulated it in those terms. But Joanna could see, in the particular way he moved through court, that he found the existing order offensive in a personal way, and was systematically looking for the pressure points where it might be made to collapse. He had the gambler's love of the overturned table, the man who has decided that if he can't win the existing game, he will burn the board and start a new one with different rules. She watched him for a year before she did anything. Then she did something small, a word in the right ear about a customs irregularity at Goldtown. A quiet suggestion to John Arryn that Lord Baelish's accounting methods might benefit from a second maester's review. Nothing that could be traced. Nothing that constituted accusation or attack. Just a slight tightening of the world around Littlefinger. A subtle message that someone was watching him with clear eyes. He received it. She could see him receive it. A very slight recalibration, a slightly increased care in his public manner, a slightly more deliberate quality to his movements at court. He didn't know who had sent the message. This was deliberate. Uncertainty was more useful than knowledge in this particular exchange. If he knew it was her, he could scheme against a specific target. Not knowing, he had to be careful everywhere. It was not a permanent solution. Littlefinger was not a problem that admitted permanent solutions, any more than dry rot admitted permanent solutions, while the conditions that created it remained. But it was management. And management in Westeros was the closest thing to peace that was usually available. In the 7th year of Robert's reign, Jon Arryn's health declined with a speed that alarmed even those who had expected it. And the hand of the king was dying in the question of succession. Who would stand beside Robert and manage the vast administrative reality of a kingdom while the king himself hunted and drank his way through his reign, was suddenly urgent. Robert, in a rare moment of political attention, spoke to Tywin Lannister about the position. Tywin came to Joanna's solar that evening with the particular expression of a man who had received what he had been working toward and found himself uncertain whether to be satisfied. "He wants me to be hand again," Tywin said. "I know," Joanna said. She had known for 3 days, since the conversation between Robert and Tywin had been preceded by a conversation between Robert and Cersei that Cersei had mentioned, carefully over tea. "You have thoughts." "I have extensive thoughts," Joanna said. "Sit down." "Tywin, this is going to take a while." Outside the window of the Tower of the Hand, they were resident in King's Landing now, had been for 2 years because the center of power was where the work was. The city moved in its perpetual restless tide of commerce and desperation and ambition. Somewhere in the Crownlands, a raven was crossing the sky with news she hadn't received yet. Somewhere north of the wall, in the blue-black cold beyond the edge of the known world, something ancient was stirring in its long sleep. But that was north, and this was now. And the immediate problem was how to make Tywin Lannister the hand of the king, in a way that served the realm rather than merely the lion. She had ideas. She always had ideas. The question, as always, was which ones the world was ready for. To Tywin Lannister became Hand of the King for the second time in the 9th year of Robert's reign, and the small council learned within a fortnight that this was a fundamentally different arrangement than anything they had previously managed. The first difference was efficiency. Tywin's administrative capacity was without peer in Westeros. He had demonstrated this in his first tenure, before Aerys's madness had made competence an offense. He arrived at the Tower of the Hand with 14 years of accumulated grievance against governmental inefficiency and the particular energy of a man who had been waiting to fix something for a very long time. The crown's debt, which had been accumulating with the cheerful indifference of a king who found numbers boring, Nash was subjected to an audit so thorough that 3 separate lords found themselves explaining expenditures they had assumed were safely buried. The city watch was reorganized. The grain stores were inventoried. The master of ships discovered that 2 of his recorded vessels did not actually exist, which was an interesting finding that led to a conversation with the master of coin that neither of them enjoyed. The second difference was Joanna. She was not the hand. She would never be the hand. The position existed in a political reality that did not accommodate women in its formal structures. And Joanna was not interested in attacking formal structures directly when she could achieve the same outcomes by other means. What she was, in practical terms, was the Hand's counsel, his editor, and occasionally his break. She read every significant document before it left the tower. She attended the informal gatherings that preceded small council meetings. She maintained her correspondence network with a scope that had expanded significantly since arriving in King's Landing, now encompassing not just the noble ladies of the 7 kingdoms, but their septas, their handmaidens, their maester's assistants, all the people who moved through the rooms where powerful men spoke freely because they had been trained to overlook the people who served them. Grand Maester Pycelle found this arrangement deeply uncomfortable, which Joanna considered a reasonable indicator that the arrangement was correct. Pycelle was a man who had survived 7 kings through the reliable practice of telling each one what they wished to hear. He delivered in the measured cadences of genuine wisdom. He was not, Joanna had concluded after careful observation, actually stupid. Stupidity would have been easier to manage. He was instead selectively intelligent, deploying his considerable learning in service of his continued comfort rather than the realm's actual needs. He had been Lannister-aligned for years, in the way that all pragmatic men in King's Landing eventually became aligned with whoever held the most power, but his alignment was the alignment of a weather vane rather than a compass. Directional only insofar as the wind blew. "Grand Maester," Joanna said to him on the 3rd week of Tywin's tenure, at one of the informal breakfasts she had established as a regular feature of Tower of the Hand life. Casual enough to feel social, structured enough to be purposeful. "And I've been reading the Citadel's recent correspondence regarding the situation at the Wall." Pycelle arranged his face into the expression of scholarly attention he had perfected over decades. "A challenging situation, my lady. The Night's Watch petitions for men and resources with some regularity. It is the nature of the institution." "The nature of the institution," Joanna repeated carefully, "is to guard the realm against threats from beyond the Wall. When the institution petitions for men with some regularity, it is generally because the threats are also regular. She poured tea with the unhurried motion of someone with complete confidence in the direction of the conversation. Lord Commander Mormont's most recent raven is quite specific about what his rangers are finding beyond the wall, or more precisely, when what his rangers are not finding, and then finding again, differently. Pycelle shifted in his chair. The rangers' reports are frequently colored by the particular stresses of ranging in extreme conditions. Cold, isolation, fear, are coloring the accounts of 20 separate men across 4 separate ranging parties over 2 years, Joanna said. Yes, that is a remarkable amount of coloring. She set down her teacup. I would like the Citadel's historical records regarding the Long Night's preconditions reviewed and summarized. I would like this done quietly, without it becoming a matter of small council discussion, before I have had the opportunity to read the findings myself. She met his eyes with a pleasant directness that she had found more effective than any alternative approach. Can I rely on you for this? And Grand Master? Pycelle understood, with the sensitivity of a man who had spent his life reading the room, that this was not a request. Of course, my lady. The small council itself was its own complex organism. Varys had reached his accommodation with Joanna in the early years and maintained it with the careful respect of a man who recognized a genuine peer. Littlefinger had been elevated to Master of Coin by the time of Tywin's appointment, a position he was genuinely excellent at, which made him more dangerous rather than less. Because incompetent schemers were manageable, incompetent ones required actual attention. Sir Barristan Selmy represented the Kingsguard with the dignity of a man who was the finest knight of his generation and knew it without arrogance, and which made him the only member of the council Joanna trusted without qualification. The council's response to Tywin's return had been a careful recalibration. Littlefinger in particular had adjusted his approach. The slightly increased care Joanna had cultivated in him 3 years prior had matured into a more general wariness around Lannister power. He was still building towards something. She could see it in every interaction. But he was building more carefully now, which meant the eventual structure would be more durable and therefore more dangerous when it finally revealed itself. She was watching him. He was watching her watch him. It was, in its way, the most honest relationship either of them had at court. Robert's reaction to Tywin's appointment had been the particular relief of a man who had just handed an enormous problem to someone else. He liked Tywin, or rather, he respected Tywin in the way that powerful men respect other powerful men, with an admixture of competitive awareness that never entirely dissolved into genuine warmth. He liked Joanna better. She was good company in a way that Tywin, for all his abilities, simply wasn't. She was funny and interested in the things Robert found interesting, and she listened to his hunting stories without the barely concealed impatience that most of the council couldn't entirely suppress. Robert Baratheon, for all his considerable flaws, was not a man who failed to notice when someone actually listened to him. This made her, in the particular calculus of Robert's court, the most effective advocate Tywin had. Not because she lobbied on his behalf, she was too careful for anything that obvious, but because Robert trusted her instincts, and her instincts, when she chose to express them, tended to support her husband's positions. Cersei's position in all of this was the most delicate thread Joanna was managing. The marriage was what it was. Joanna had long since accepted that she could not make Robert love her daughter. Love was not a resource she could redistribute through careful political management, much as she occasionally wished it were. What she could do was ensure that Cersei's position was secure in ways that didn't depend on Robert's affection, and that Cersei's own behavior didn't provide ammunition to those who might wish to undermine her. The twins were born in the second year of the marriage. Joffrey first, then within a year, Myrcella. This history's Cersei had been different enough in her psychology, had enough of her mother's pragmatic self-awareness alongside her own formidable intelligence, that the particular madness of the history that might have been had not fully taken root. She still loved Jaime in the complicated, intensity without boundary way that the Lannister twins had always loved each other. This was, Joanna had concluded, with the complicated grief of a mother who sees clearly, simply what they were. shaped by proximity and temperament and years of being each other's primary witness in a family that was not generous with warmth. But the recklessness had been tempered. Cersei understood, with her mother's voice regularly providing calibration, now what the cost of exposure would be, not just to herself but to Jaime, to the children, to everything they were both trying to protect. Joffrey was the problem that Joanna had not fully anticipated. She had known he would be difficult. Children who grew up in the particular atmosphere of Robert's court, with a father who was present but checked out, and a mother whose love was absolute and therefore somewhat blinding, tended to develop without the friction that shaped character. But Joffrey's specific variety of difficulty was something she had not encountered before in her experience of children, and she had encountered a wide variety. He was not simply spoiled or attention-seeking or the product of inadequate discipline. There was something in him, some fundamental absence where empathy should have been, some pleasure in cruelty that went beyond the ordinary small cruelties of children and carried a different quality entirely, that made her deeply uneasy in a way she found difficult to name precisely. She named it to Tywin on a night in the second year of Joffrey's life, sitting in their chambers in the Tower of the Hand with the candles burning low. He pulled the cat's legs off, she said, not in the way children sometimes hurt animals without understanding. He watched it. He was interested in what happened. Tywin was quiet for a moment. He is 2 years old. I know how old he is. She looked at the fire. I'm telling you what I saw, not what I've concluded from it. Yeah, I'm concluding that we need to pay very careful attention to who this child is becoming. He is the prince of the realm. He is a child who may become a king, Joanna said, which is the most dangerous kind of child, if he is what I'm afraid he might be. She turned to look at her husband directly. We have some years before it matters in any formal sense. I intend to use them. What followed was the most sustained educational project of Joanna's life. She could not be Joffrey's primary caretaker. The structures of the court didn't allow it, and Cersei's maternal instincts were too fierce for direct displacement. What she could do was shape the environment. The septa she selected for Joffrey's early religious instruction was a woman of genuine moral clarity rather than performative piety. The master-at-arms she recommended was a man who emphasized discipline and consequence alongside skill. She arranged for Joffrey to spend significant time with Myrcella, whose natural temperament was sunnier and more generous, on the theory that human models of behavior were more effective than abstract instruction. She also had a long, careful conversation with Cersei about Joffrey that was the most difficult conversation they had ever had. More difficult than the conversations about Jaime, more difficult than the conversations about Robert, because this one required Cersei to see something about her eldest child that her love made nearly impossible to see clearly. Cersei sat with it for 3 days. Then she came back to her mother and said, "Eat with the expression of a woman who has paid a real internal price for an honest conclusion. Tell me what to do." It was not a solution. Joffrey was not a problem that admitted clean solutions. He was a temperament, and temperaments were not remade by educational programs, however carefully designed. But he was younger than he had been in the history that might have been before he began his formal education in power and consequence, and the particular atrocities of that history. Micah the butcher's boy, the dire wolf, the systematic cruelties of a king who had never been checked. Those had not happened yet and might not happen if the people around him were careful and consistent and willing to do the hard work of holding him to account when his nature pushed against its constraints. Might not. Joanna was too clear-eyed for certainty. When it was in the 12th year of Robert's reign that the ravens began arriving from the north with a new quality of urgency. Lord Commander Mormont's dispatches had been regular and increasingly alarming for 2 years. Joanna had been reading every one of them, cross-referencing them with the Citadel's historical summary that Pycelle had quietly commissioned, building a picture that she did not entirely like the shape of. She brought the accumulated correspondence to Tywin on a gray morning that felt, in its particular quality of cold light and sea wind, like a door closing on something. "Read these," she said, setting them on his desk. "All of them, in order." Tywin read. He was a fast reader. Efficiency extended to everything, and he finished in less time than she expected. Then he sat back and looked at her with the expression that meant he had arrived at a conclusion and was deciding whether he liked it. The maesters dismiss this, he said. Pycelle does, Joanna agreed. The historical record doesn't. The long night was real, Tywin. The wall was built for a reason that wasn't decorative. She sat down. Something is moving beyond it. Something that Mormont's rangers are encountering and not surviving to describe in detail. The wall has stood for 8,000 years. Yes, Joanna said. And for 8,000 years, whatever it was built to hold back has apparently been waiting. She looked at him steadily. I think we need to send someone to the wall. Someone capable of making an accurate assessment rather than a politically convenient one. Tywin considered. Jaime. Not Jaime. Jaime is too valuable here and too visible. His presence at the wall would generate political interpretation we don't want. She had thought about this carefully. Tyrion. Tywin's expression shifted in the complicated way it always did when Tyrion was the subject. But Joanna continued before he could redirect. He is 24 years old. He has read everything the Citadel has produced on the history of the Watch, and he has a quality of observation that is not complicated by military pride or political ambition. He will see what is actually there and tell us what it actually is. She paused. And it will do him good to have a task worthy of his abilities. Tywin was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a raven settled on the tower's edge, black against the gray sky. Amber and regarded the city below with the indifferent attention of things that existed before kings and would exist after. Send him, Tywin said finally. Joanna wrote to Tyrion that afternoon. She told him about the ravens. She told him what she needed him to see. And at the end of the letter, in the personal postscript that she always added and that Tyrion always claimed not to be moved by, she wrote, The wall is older than every house in Westeros. Whatever it was built for has not forgotten why. She sealed it with the Lion of Lannister and sent it north. Tyrion Lannister arrived at Castle Black in the 43rd day of his journey north, and he did what he always did upon arriving anywhere. He looked at everything, said nothing immediately useful, and drank enough to ensure that the people around him underestimated him before he began asking questions. The wall was not what he had expected, and he had expected something considerable. He had read the histories. He had read Maester Aemon's published correspondence, the ranger reports his mother had forwarded, the Citadel's careful and deliberately understated summary of the long night's historical record. He had built a picture in his mind of something vast and ancient and significant. Standing at its base on the morning after his arrival, looking up at 700 feet of ice that had been here before the Targaryens, before the Andals, before any kingdom whose name he knew, Tyrion felt the particular intellectual humility that only truly large things produce in truly intelligent people. It was also, he noted, groaning, not loudly, not in a way that the men of the Night's Watch, accustomed to its sounds, seemed to register as unusual, but a low, deep, structural sound that Tyrion, who had read enough about engineering to understand the difference between the sounds of a stable structure and an unstable one, found interesting in a way he did not immediately share with anyone. Lord Commander Jeor Mormont received him in the commander's tower with the particular wariness of a man who had been sending ravens south for 2 years and receiving polite acknowledgement in return. He was a large man, broad and gray-bearded, with the quality of someone who had been competent all his life and was now facing something that competence alone could not resolve. His raven, a large, unaged bird that seemed to regard Tyrion with the specific disdain of animals who have spent too long around humans to retain any illusions about them, sat on his shoulder and periodically commented on the proceedings in terms that did not improve them. Your mother sent you, Mormont said. It was not quite an accusation. My mother sends me everywhere useful, Tyrion said pleasantly. It is one of her more endearing qualities, also one of her more exhausting ones. He looked around the commander's tower with the systematic attention he brought to every new space. The maps, the correspondence stacked with the organization of a man overwhelmed but disciplined, the specific letter on top of the pile that bore the Citadel seal and had clearly been read several times. She also reads everything you send south, every word. And I mention this because some people find it easier to speak knowing that their audience is genuinely paying attention. Mormont studied him. You're not what I expected. No one expects the short Lannister, Tyrion said. It's rather my defining characteristic. May I see the ranger reports? The complete ones, not the versions that were summarized for the small council. The complete reports were considerably more alarming than the summaries. Tyrion read them over 3 days, in the order they had been written, cross-referencing the dates against weather reports and against the accounts in the older histories he had brought in 3 trunks from the Rock's library. He slept infrequently. He drank consistently, because drinking kept his hands occupied and his social manner lubricated without significantly impairing the part of his mind that processed information. He asked questions of everyone who would answer them: rangers, stewards, builders, the older brothers who had been at the wall long enough to have personal memory of things that the recent reports described. On the 4th day, he asked to speak with Maester Aemon. Aemon Targaryen was very old enough that his age had become a different category of thing, not the accumulated years of an elderly man, but something approaching geological time, a mind that had been present for so much history that it had achieved a particular clarity about patterns. He was blind, which had given his other senses a compensatory acuity that Tyrion found remarkable. He could not see Tyrion enter the room, but he said before Tyrion had spoken, "You have your mother's quality of attention. I can hear it in how you move." Tyrion sat down across from the old man and decided on the basis of this opening to dispense with any version of courtly approach. The Ranger reports describe encounters with things that match the historical accounts of White Walkers, he said. The historical accounts of White Walkers were, until recently, treated as mythology. The Ranger reports are written by men who are not, as a rule, prone to mythology. What am I missing? Aemon was quiet for a moment. A candle between them guttered in a draft from the wall's particular cold, which was a different cold than the ordinary northern cold. Deeper, older, carrying a quality that Tyrion had noticed on his first morning and not been able to precisely name. "Hannah, you are missing nothing," Aemon said finally. "You are seeing clearly. The difficulty is not in the seeing, but in the convincing." "Tell me about the convincing." 8,000 years ago, Aemon said, with the patience of a man who had been waiting for someone worth telling this to, the long night lasted a generation, winter without end, cold that killed crops and froze rivers and extinguished whole settlements, and, with the cold, creatures that the historical record describes with remarkable consistency across cultures that had no contact with each other. The free folks' accounts, the first men's carved records, the children of the forest's oral traditions as recorded by the earliest maesters, cold, intelligent, ancient, capable of raising the dead. He paused. The wall was built with magic as much as ice, and the Night's Watch was created to man it. Both institutions have degraded over 8,000 years in the way that all institutions degrade when the threat they were built to address seems to have passed. He turned his sightless eyes toward Tyrion with an accuracy that was slightly unsettling. The threat has not passed. It has been waiting. For what? That, Aemon said, is the question the histories do not answer cleanly. The consensus among the oldest accounts is that the long night ended through a combination of the wall's raising and a specific defeat of the Night King, a figure apparently of singular authority over the others. He folded his hands. The method of that defeat is variously described. The consistent elements are fire and a weapon of specific properties and a sacrifice. Tyrion was quiet for a moment, kept processing. And the current Lord Commander believes the situation is reaching a threshold. The current Lord Commander has been watching his rangers not return from beyond the wall with increasing frequency for 2 years, Aemon said. He is a practical man who does not use words like threshold. But yes. Tyrion spent the rest of that day at the wall's base, walking its length in the section accessible from Castle Black, examining it with the attention of an engineer who had read about engineering without practicing it, which meant his observations were theoretical but not uninformed. The groaning he had noticed on his first morning was real and consistent. He found in 3 separate locations, sections where the ice had a different quality, slightly darker, slightly less opaque, some with a surface temperature that his bare hand registered as meaningfully colder than the surrounding ice. Not the cold of winter, something else, something that had no obvious natural explanation. He wrote to his mother that evening. He wrote for 3 hours, filling 12 pages with observations, cross-references, historical citations, and conclusions arranged from most to least certain. He was not a man who dramatized. His mother had always said that drama was what you added when your actual information was insufficient, and his actual information was sufficient. He wrote plainly and specifically about what he had seen and what he believed it meant. At the end of the letter he wrote, "You were right to send me. You are, as usual, irritatingly right about most things. And the situation is worse than the summaries suggest and better than panic would imply. There is still time, but time is the operative variable, and it is moving in one direction. We need dragonglass. We need it in significant quantities, and we need it at the wall. The only source I can identify in sufficient volume is Dragonstone. I recognize the political complexity of this observation, and I'm making it anyway because political complexity is preferable to the alternative." He paused, then added, "Also, the wall is groaning in 3 specific locations in a way I don't like. You should probably know that." He sealed it and gave it to the Raven Keeper, who sent it south with the particular efficiency of a man who had learned that the Tower of the Hand's correspondence was handled with unusual speed. Joanna received it 11 days later. He read it twice and brought it to Tywin before breakfast. The political complexity Tyrion had referenced was considerable. Dragonstone was the ancestral seat of House Targaryen, currently occupied by Stannis Baratheon as Robert's master of ships and most powerful bannerman, a reward for his service in the rebellion that Stannis had accepted with the particular resentment of a man who knew he deserved more and had been given less. The relationship between Stannis and the Lannisters was the specific temperature of cold that preceded ice. Not openly hostile, but containing no warmth that might complicate future conflict. "We need to send someone to Dragonstone," Joanna said. Tywin looked at the letter. He had read it once, which was always sufficient for Tywin. "Stannis won't cooperate with a Lannister request." "No," Joanna agreed, "which is why the request won't come from a Lannister." She had been thinking about this since finishing the letter. "It will come from the Night's Watch, formally through Lord Commander Mormont, with the Night's Watch's seal and the Watch's specific framing. A military necessity for the defense of the realm, above politics." She looked at her husband. "Stannis takes his duty seriously, more seriously than almost any other lord in Westeros. If the request is framed correctly, as a matter of the realm's defense rather than Lannister advantage, he may respond to it. And if he doesn't, then we make the request again with more information," Joanna said, "and we keep making it until the information is sufficient to compel a response." She paused. "Tyrion should stay at the wall. He's building relationships there that will be useful. Why can Mormont trust him? Which is not a thing Mormont gives easily. I want eyes at the wall that I trust." Tywin looked at her with the particular expression he wore when he was revising his assessment of something. "You're building a network at the wall." "I'm building a network everywhere," Joanna said. "I've been building a network everywhere for 15 years. The wall seemed like an important node." She picked up the letter. "Our son has also apparently identified 3 structural weaknesses in the wall's ice that warrant further investigation. I'd like to know if that investigation produces concerning findings before it produces concerning events." The ravens flew north and south in the days that followed. Mormont's formal request to Stannis was drafted with Tyrion's input and Joanna's careful revision of the framing. She rewrote the opening paragraph twice to remove any language that Stannis might interpret as Lannister influence, which required intimate familiarity with how Stannis Baratheon's particular mind processed requests and what triggered his reflexive suspicion. She had, over the years of his residence at court, built a reasonable model of Stannis' psychology. He was a man who responded to fairness, duty, and clear logical argument, and who was immune to charm, flattery, and social pressure. You did not convince Stannis by making him like you. You convinced Stannis by being correct. The letter to Dragonstone was therefore extremely correct. While the ravens flew, Joanna turned her attention to the small council and the challenge of moving the realm toward a threat it was not inclined to acknowledge. This was the deepest difficulty, not the logistics of dragonglass or the structural concerns about the wall, but the fundamental human resistance to believing in a danger that was distant, ancient, and required accepting that the stories told to frighten children were actually true. Varys, she approached directly. She brought him Tyrion's letter and watched him read it with the careful attention he brought to all information. When he finished, he was quiet for a moment that felt genuine rather than performed. "Your son," he said, "has a remarkable mind. He has his father's strategic capacity and my ability to see clearly without wanting to," Joanna said. "It is occasionally a burden for him." She looked at the spider steadily. "I need your little birds to start listening specifically for anything related to what's happening beyond the wall. Travelers from the north, free folk who've crossed south, merchants who work the northern routes, anything. This will divert resources from—" "I know what it will divert them from," Joanna said. "I'm asking you to make that judgment call in the direction I'm indicating, because I believe the information Tyrion has gathered represents an actual existential threat to the realm, and the realm is what you serve. Your words on multiple occasions." She let that sit. "Am I wrong about what you serve?" Varys looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes that she couldn't entirely read, which was unusual. She could usually read Varys with sufficient confidence. "No," he said finally. "You are not wrong." Littlefinger was not approached. Joanna had thought carefully about this and concluded that Littlefinger's particular worldview, his fundamental orientation toward chaos as opportunity, toward the destabilization of existing structures, made him an unreliable participant in any project aimed at defending those structures. The long night, if it came, would not distinguish between lords and small folk, Lannisters and Starks, schemers and honest men. Littlefinger did not believe in things that did not distinguish. He believed in leverage, and a threat that killed everyone was a threat that left no one to be leveraged. She would work around him. She had been working around him for years. It was becoming familiar, if not comfortable. In the north, Tyrion had begun a different kind of work. He had been at the wall long enough to understand the Watch's culture, its particular combination of duty and despair, the way that men who had been sent here as punishment alongside men who had come from genuine vocation created a community with unusual psychological complexity. He had the gift of finding people interesting regardless of their station, which in the Night's Watch, where station had been largely stripped away, was an enormously effective social tool. He drank with rangers and stewards and builders without discrimination. He listened to their concerns about supply shortages, the declining quality of recruits, the Watch's diminishing reputation in the South, with the attention of someone who intended to do something about what he heard. He had also, in his ranging excursions with experienced brothers, seen beyond the wall. Not far, he was not a fighter, and he had the self-awareness to know that his value lay in his mind rather than his sword arm, and sending his mind into unnecessary danger was poor resource management, but far enough twice to see the tree line where the forest began, and to feel, on both occasions, a quality of attention from the darkness between the trees that he could not rationally account for and could not dismiss. Something was watching. He wrote this to his mother, too, because she had asked for everything, and Tyrion Lannister's particular relationship with his mother. Complicated, layered. The relationship of two people who were genuinely similar in ways that occasionally made proximity difficult, meant that he gave her everything she asked for, including the things he couldn't quite explain. She wrote back, "I believe you. Come home in the spring. There is work here that needs your specific abilities, and I will not have you ranging beyond the wall for research purposes. Your value is in what you know, not in what you can personally verify at unnecessary personal risk." He wrote back, "You sound like father." She wrote back, "Your father would have told you to stay home in considerably fewer words, and with no acknowledgement that you had a value worth protecting. Do not mistake efficiency for similarity." He read this in the commander's tower with the walls cold pressing against the shuttered windows, and something that was not quite a smile settled on his face for a moment before he went back to work. Stannis Baratheon's response to the Night's Watch's formal request arrived at Castle Black 40 days after the Ravens flew south, and it was, characteristically, a single page. The Dragon Glass would be made available. Lord Commander Mormont could send men to Dragonstone to collect it at his earliest convenience. There was no elaboration, no political qualification, no request for reciprocal consideration. Stannis had read the letter, assessed the logical argument, concluded it was correct, and responded accordingly. This was what Stannis did. It was, Tyrion had reflected in his correspondence to his mother, so simultaneously his greatest quality and the reason he would never be a successful king. A man who responded only to correct logical argument in a world where most people were not making correct logical arguments was a man perpetually out of alignment with his environment. Tyrion wrote to Joanna with the news, and then supervised the organization of the Dragonglass shipment with the systematic attention he had been applying to everything at the Wall. Mormont had provided him with 3 rangers. Good men, experienced men, the kind who had been beyond the Wall enough times to carry the specific quality of watchfulness that ranging produced, and they made the journey to Dragonstone and back in 6 weeks. In returning with 40 crates of the black volcanic glass that the children of the forest had once used to arm themselves against the first long night. The crates were stored in Castle Black's deepest vault, and Tyrion spent 2 days with the Watch's blacksmith, a competent man named Donal Noy, who had lost an arm and brought his craft north with him in the way that some men brought their religion, working through the practical challenges of turning raw dragon glass into weapons that could actually be used in combat. The results were imperfect. Dragon glass was brittle in ways that conventional weapons weren't, and the binding of dragon glass tips to wooden shafts required techniques that Noy had to develop through trial and error in real time, which produced a significant amount of broken glass and creative profanity. But by the end of the 2 days, they had a process, and the process could be scaled, and scaling it was the next problem. Tyrion wrote up everything he had learned, the binding methods, the failure modes, the most effective shapes for different applications, and sent the documents south with a raven to his mother and a separate copy to Maester Aemon for the Watch's own records. Information hoarded was information that died with whoever held it. This was one of the things he and his mother agreed on without needing to discuss it. He left the Wall in the early spring of the following year, as Joanna had instructed, and he brought with him something he hadn't anticipated taking. A genuine respect for the men of the Night's Watch that sat oddly alongside everything he had previously thought about the institution. While he had come expecting an organization in decline, and he had found that too, the decline was real, the numbers were insufficient, the Southern Lord's dismissal of the Watch's warnings was a political failure of the First Order. But he had also found men who had stayed at their post when leaving would have been easy, who maintained their vigil against a threat that no one believed in, who got up every morning in the cold and did their duty without expectation of reward or recognition. He had, over 6 months at the Wall, come to find this more admirable than almost anything he had encountered in King's Landing. He arrived back at the Tower of the Hand, thin from the northern diet, and with a beard that he was experimentally maintaining, and his mother met him in the tower's lower hall before he had removed his traveling cloak. She looked at him, really looked at him, in the way she had always been able to, and said, "You're different." "The Wall is large," Tyrion said. "It adjusts your sense of proportion. Sit down, eat something, then tell me everything that isn't in the letters." He told her everything. She listened without interruption, which was her way. She gathered information completely before she began processing it visibly, and interrupting the gathering was inefficient. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "The structural weaknesses," she said. "Did Noy have any assessment of their significance?" "He thinks they're old, not recent deterioration, something that was always there, or has been developing for centuries. The Wall's magic is what's been compensating." Tyrion accepted a cup of wine from a servant with the reflexive gratitude of a man who had spent 6 months at Castle Black's table. Aemon's view is that the Wall's magical properties are tied in some way to the Night's Watch's strength. Not numerically, but the nature of the oath, the genuine commitment of the men who serve. As the Watch has declined in quality and purpose, the magical element of the Wall's construction has degraded with it. Joanna took this in. So replenishing the Watch matters beyond the simple military arithmetic. Apparently, though the simple military arithmetic is also concerning. He paused. "We need the lords of Westeros to send men, Mother. Not criminals, men. Younger sons who are actually capable. And the Watch needs soldiers, and it needs them to mean their oaths." This was the conversation that Joanna had been preparing for, in various ways, since receiving Tyrion's first letter from the Wall. The political challenge of convincing the realm's lords to take the Night's Watch seriously, to send quality men rather than the dregs of their dungeons, to provision the watch adequately rather than viewing the ravens as an inconvenience, was not a challenge that admitted a single solution. It required pressure from multiple directions simultaneously, built over time, with the patience of someone who understood that institutional change was slow and the alternative was catastrophic. She had been building that pressure. The correspondence network she had developed over the years had been quietly redirected in recent months toward the Northern question. The ladies of the great houses, women who had, in most cases, far more political influence over their lords than anyone formally acknowledged, had been receiving letters from Lady Joanna that discussed, with careful indirection, the situation at the Wall. Not alarmist letters, not letters that could be dismissed as a woman's hysteria about old stories. Letters that asked intelligent questions and provided interesting historical context and gently suggested that the Night's Watch's current state of resource deprivation was something that thoughtful lords might wish to consider. Lady Catelyn Stark had been the most receptive. Joanna had cultivated the relationship carefully over years. Catelyn Tully had married into the North and therefore had direct proximity to the issues at the Wall, and she was a woman of genuine intelligence who took her responsibilities as Lady of Winterfell seriously. Their correspondence had begun formally with the cautious courtesy of women whose families occupied complicated political positions relative to each other, and had gradually warmed into something approaching genuine intellectual friendship. Catelyn had written in her most recent letter that Lord Eddard had been sending additional men and supply wagons north every year for 3 years now, quietly, without public announcement, because he took Mormont's ravens seriously even when the small council didn't. This was useful information in 2 directions, and it told Joanna that Ned Stark's fundamental seriousness about threats could be engaged on this issue, which she had suspected, and it gave her a model, quiet, consistent support for the Watch, below the threshold of political controversy, that she could encourage other lords to replicate. The harder work was at the small council itself. Tywin had the hand's authority to direct resources, but directing significant crown resources toward the Night's Watch required either Robert's active support or a level of administrative sleight of hand that Tywin found philosophically distasteful. Joanna had therefore spent 6 months working on Robert. Working on Robert required the particular patience of someone who understood that direct argument was the wrong tool. Robert was not a man who responded to direct argument. He responded to enthusiasm, and not to the sense that something was worth his attention, to stories rather than analyses. Joanna had told him stories. At the informal dinners she managed at the hunting evenings, where she was sometimes present in the early stages before the men departed, she had told Robert stories about the long night, not as political briefing, but as history, as the kind of bloody dramatic material that Robert genuinely loved. The stories of the Night King and the Last Hero and the Raising of the Wall were, taken on their narrative merits, exactly the kind of heroic ancient drama that Robert Baratheon found compelling. She told them well. She had always been a good storyteller, and good storytelling was, in its bones, the same skill as political persuasion. You found the version of the truth that connected with what your audience already cared about. Why? And you made it vivid. Robert, to his credit, was not stupid. He was incurious and self-indulgent and better suited to war than governance. But he was not stupid, and when he encountered information presented in a form his mind engaged with, he processed it. By the time Tyrion returned from the Wall, Robert had twice raised the Night's Watch in small council meetings as a matter requiring attention, not with the nuanced sophistication that the situation warranted, but with the king's blunt authority, which had its own effectiveness. Tyrion appeared before the small council a week after his return. He had been briefed by his mother on the council's current dynamics: Varys's quiet cooperation, Littlefinger's watchful non-participation, Pycelle's continued skepticism dressed as scholarly caution, and he had prepared accordingly. He presented his findings with the particular combination of precision and accessibility that he had over years developed as his primary intellectual tool. Everything accurate, nothing unnecessarily complex. the most alarming information delivered last so that the cumulative weight of the earlier evidence made it land correctly. When he finished, the small council chamber was quiet for a moment. Robert said, "How many men does the watch need?" "Minimally functional against the current threat level. 2,000 additional brothers, provisioned adequately and armed with dragon glass," Tyrion said, "which requires a crown decree compelling lords to send quality men rather than criminals, and crown resources to supplement what the lords provide." Robert looked at Tywin. Tywin looked at Joanna, who was present in the unofficial capacity she had established over 2 years of these meetings. She gave him the fractional nod that meant, "Yes, now this is the moment." "It will be done," Tywin said. Littlefinger raised a concern about the cost. It was a genuine concern. The Crown's debt was not fully resolved, and committing significant resources to the Night's Watch represented a real financial decision. Tyrion addressed it directly, with the specific numbers he had prepared, making the case that the cost of adequate preparation was orders of magnitude lower than the cost of inadequate preparation if the threat materialized. Littlefinger listened to this with the expression of a man who was filing the information away rather than responding to it in the moment, which was, Joanna noted, a different quality of attention than his usual performance of engagement. After the council, Littlefinger fell into step beside her in the corridor. "Lady Joanna," he said with the particular warmth he deployed toward people he was assessing, "your son made a compelling case. My son went to the wall and looked at what was there and reported what he saw," Joanna said. "The compelling quality is in the evidence, not the presentation." "And yet presentation matters," Littlefinger said. "The same evidence presented differently would not have moved the council in the same way." He paused. "You prepared him for this room." "I prepare everyone for every room," Joanna said pleasantly. "It is what I do." She stopped walking and turned to look at him directly, which she did when she wanted someone to understand that she was not engaging in performance. "Lord Baelish, I know what you're building. I have known for several years. I am telling you this plainly, not as a threat, because I think you are intelligent enough to appreciate plain speech." She held his gaze. "Whatever you are building, the chaos, the ladder, the new order you imagine emerging from the old one's collapse, it will not survive what is coming from the north. There is no ladder in the long night. There is no position to climb to when the dead walk." She let that settle. "I am not asking you to stop being what you are. I am asking you to make a rational calculation about what your ambitions require, and that calculation requires a living realm." Littlefinger looked at her for a long moment. His expression did not give much away, which was its own kind of information. "You are," he said finally, "the most dangerous person in King's Landing." "No," Joanna said. "I am the most dangerous person in King's Landing who is not trying to be dangerous. That is a different thing." She began walking again. "Think about what I've said, my lord. I have found, over the years, that rational men eventually arrive at rational conclusions. I am extending you the courtesy of assuming you are rational." She left him in the corridor and did not look back, because looking back was what you did when you were uncertain, and she was not uncertain. What she was, though she would not have said this to anyone including Tywin, was afraid. Not the fear that paralyzed. The other kind, the cold. A clarifying fear that made you see clearly and move carefully and refuse to waste a single hour on anything that didn't matter. She had been afraid like this since reading Tyrion's first detailed letter from the wall, and the fear had been useful, had driven everything she had built since then. The network, the dragon glass, the small council's redirected attention, the quiet campaign to resupply and restore the Night's Watch. But she was not naive enough to believe that she had solved the problem. She had bought time, and time was valuable, and time was also finite. In the north, beyond the wall, in the blue-black dark, where Tyrion's rangers had felt themselves watched, something ancient and patient was continuing to do what it had been doing for 8,000 years. It was waiting for winter, and winter in Westeros always came. The 14th year of Robert's reign arrived with a winter that the maester's records would describe, with characteristic understatement, as significant. It had been building for 3 years, the gradual shortening of summers that the Citadel tracked through its glass candles and barometric instruments. the early frost that killed the Reach's third harvest in succession, the particular quality of the cold that settled over the north like something that intended to stay. Farmers who had been farming the same land for 4 generations said it felt different from ordinary winter. They could not have articulated precisely how, but farmers who work the same land for generations develop a relationship with seasonal change that is more intimate than anything a maester's instruments can capture. And what they were feeling was not ordinary winter. Joanna received the harvest reports with the attention she gave everything, and she cross-referenced them against Tyrion's observations from the wall and against the historical accounts of the long night's preconditions, and the picture they assembled together was not one she liked. She was also managing simultaneously a crisis that had nothing to do with the North and everything to do with the South. Jon Arryn was dead. He had declined with a speed that alarmed everyone and surprised no one. He had been old and overworked, and the city's damp had been eroding his health for years. His death was, in the formal sense, unremarkable. An aging lord succumbing to illness, mourned appropriately, replaced by necessity. The small council had processed his passing with the efficient grief of an institution that could not afford to stop. What made his death complicated was the letter he had apparently been writing in his final weeks. Varys brought this to Joanna's attention, as he brought all sensitive information, through the particular method he had developed for communications he did not wish to be observed. A book left in the Tower of the Hand's library, a specific page marked, a note in the margin in a hand that was not his own, but that she recognized as one of his information conduits. The note said only, "Arryn was investigating something before the fever. The investigation is unfinished. The findings, such as they are, have not survived him cleanly." She understood immediately. She had understood, in some careful corner of her mind, but for years had noticed and deliberately not examined the particular quality of Joffrey's features, the specific shade of his hair, the jaw that did not resemble Robert's jaw, or the Tully jaw that Cersei didn't have, but that Lannister blood did. She was his grandmother. She had held him as an infant. She knew what she knew, and she had spent years deciding what to do with knowing it. Jon Arryn had apparently begun to ask questions that led in the same direction. She went to Cersei that evening, not to Tywin, not yet, not first, to Cersei. Her daughter received her in the Queen's solar with the particular expression that Cersei wore when she was afraid and was using anger as a container for the fear. She had always done this, since childhood, since the first time she had encountered something genuinely threatening and discovered that rage was more comfortable to inhabit than vulnerability. Joanna had spent 20 years learning to see past the anger to what it was protecting. "You know why I'm here?" Joanna said. She sat down without being invited, because they were past the point where such conventions served any purpose. Jon Arryn was asking questions. Cersei's expression did not change in any way that a stranger would have noticed. But Joanna was not a stranger, and what she saw was the specific quality of stillness that her daughter produced when something landed squarely on the fear she was containing. "Jon Arryn is dead." "Yes, his questions are not necessarily." Joanna looked at her daughter steadily. "I need to know, Cersei, all of it, not what I have already reasoned toward, what actually happened and when, and what he might have found." The silence stretched for a long moment. The solar's fire settled. Outside the window, King's Landing moved in its perpetual restless commerce, indifferent to the conversations happening above it. "The children are Robert's," Cersei said. Her voice was careful in the way that precisely constructed sentences are careful, built to be technically defensible. "Robert has no legitimate grounds." "Cersei." Joanna said her daughter's name with the specific quality she had developed over decades, that carried in it everything she was and everything she felt, and the full weight of a relationship that was the most complicated thing in her life. "I am not Robert. I am not Varys. I am not anyone you need to manage." She paused. "I am your mother, and I am trying to keep you alive, and I cannot do that with incomplete information." Another silence. Then Cersei looked at her with an expression that Joanna had not seen on her daughter's face since Cersei was 8 years old and had broken something she valued and was deciding whether to tell the truth about how the specific look of someone calculating whether the relief of honesty was worth the cost of exposure, she told her. Joanna listened without interruption, without visible reaction, with the full attention she gave everything that mattered. When Cersei finished, the fire had burned lower, and the room was darker, and both women sat in the quiet for a moment that contained everything the words had just made real. How many people know? Joanna said. Varys suspects. Littlefinger? Cersei stopped. Well, Littlefinger knows more than he should. He always does. Yes. Joanna had anticipated this. Littlefinger, who had loved Catelyn Tully and transferred that love into a general acquisition of leverage over the powerful, who had understood from his first weeks at court that information was the only currency that compounded. Littlefinger had almost certainly been watching the Queen with the specific attention of a man who collected what other people preferred to keep private. Who else? Stannis Baratheon has been seen meeting with a ship captain who traveled to Dragonstone frequently in the past year. I don't know what he has or doesn't have. Joanna absorbed this. Stannis was the variable that changed everything. Stannis, who was rigid with duty and literal-minded about law, and who had the specific kind of integrity that did not negotiate with inconvenient truths. Stannis, who was also Robert's brother, and therefore had the most direct interest in the succession's legitimacy. Stannis knowing, or beginning to know, or suspecting, was a crisis of a different order than Littlefinger knowing. Littlefinger used information for leverage. Stannis used information for action. Does Robert know? Joanna asked. No. Is there any possibility he could have noticed? Robert notices nothing that does not involve a hunting horn, a wine cup, or a woman who isn't me, Cersei said, with a flatness that contained within it the entire history of her marriage. Joanna was quiet for a long moment. She was thinking through the variables with the cold clarity that fear produced in her, the kind of thinking that set aside everything except what was true and what was necessary. This was the most dangerous situation she had managed in 20 years of managing dangerous situations, because its discovery would not produce a political inconvenience. It would produce a war. Not the War of Five Kings of the history that might have been necessarily, but something. Stannis declaring, the realm fracturing, everything she had spent years carefully building to address the threat from the north collapsing into the chaos of another southern conflict at precisely the moment when the north needed unified attention. She had to manage Stannis, and she had to manage Littlefinger, and she had to do both without either of them knowing she was doing it, because Stannis's response to the perception of manipulation would be to act more aggressively, and Littlefinger's response would be to complicate the situation beyond anyone's ability to manage. I need a week, Joanna said finally. Say nothing to anyone, not to Jaime, not to your ladies, not in letters. A week. And then what? Cersei asked with the specific quality of someone who is asking what the plan is, because they need to believe there is one. And then I will have done what I can, Joanna said. She stood. She did something then that she did rarely, not because she felt it rarely, but because she was her father's daughter as well as her own woman. And her father had not been a man who expressed feeling in physical terms. She crossed to her daughter and held her, briefly and firmly, with the full acknowledgement of what they were to each other and what the situation was and what she intended to do about it. I am not going to let them take your children, she said quietly. That is not sentiment. It is a statement of intent. She left the solar and went immediately to find Varys. He was, as he usually was when she needed him urgently, apparently not where she expected to find him, which was itself a kind of answer. Varys was never where you expected him unless he wanted to be found, and not wanting to be found usually meant he was processing information he hadn't yet decided how to use. She sent a specific kind of message through a channel they had established years ago for communications that could not be written. Rennie appeared at the Tower of the Hand 2 hours later with the expression of a man who had been expecting to be summoned. You've heard, she said. I hear most things, Varys said carefully. Then you know what Stannis may have. She sat across from him in the tower's private study, with the door closed and no servants within earshot. I need to know the extent of what he has and what he intends to do with it. Lady Joanna, Varys said with a delicacy she recognized as genuine rather than performed, what you are asking me to do is gather intelligence on a potential succession crisis in order to prevent a war, Joanna said, in order to prevent the kind of conflict that will tear the realm apart at precisely the moment when the realm cannot afford to be torn apart. She looked at him steadily. I am not asking you to act against the realm's interests. I am asking you to act against a specific crisis that will damage those interests irreparably. You know what is coming from the north. Tyrion's report was explicit. A war of succession now. Over this, while the Night King's army grows beyond the wall, that is not an outcome that serves the realm you claim to serve. Varys was quiet for a moment that felt like genuine deliberation. What do you intend to do with what I find? Manage it, Joanna said. The way I manage everything, carefully, with the minimum force necessary, and with the realm's survival as the primary objective. And your family's position, Varys said, not as an accusation, as an acknowledgement of reality. My family's position and the realm's survival are not, in this case, in conflict, Joanna said. Now the children are legitimate in the eyes of Robert and in the records of the kingdom. Destabilizing that now serves no one except men who profit from instability. She paused. You know who profits from instability. Varys's expression shifted fractionally. Lord Baelish. Yes. Joanna looked at the candle between them, burning with the steady indifference of flame that did not care about the conversation happening around it. Stannis acting on whatever he has found is the outcome Littlefinger is working toward. I have believed this for 2 years. The chaos of a succession crisis, lords choosing sides, Robert's authority undermined. This is the ladder Lord Baelish is trying to climb, and Stannis' honor is the tool he is planning to use to build the first rungs. She looked back at Varys. Help me prevent it, not for my family, for the realm. Varys looked at her for a long moment, with the expression she had learned to read as genuine engagement rather than performed consideration. You know, he said, that if the truth is, as you suggest, there is an argument that the realm deserves to know it. The realm deserves to survive the winter that is coming, Joanna said quietly. What the realm deserves and what the realm can withstand are not always the same thing. I am asking you to help me prioritize withstanding. She paused. After the long night, if we survive the long night, I will personally ensure that the succession is managed appropriately. There are ways to address these questions that don't require the realm to tear itself apart, ways that involve conversations rather than armies. She met his eyes. But those conversations require a living realm to have them in. Varys was quiet for a very long moment. Outside, a raven crossed the tower's window, black against the winter sky, carrying someone's urgent words somewhere that needed them. I will find out what Stannis has, he said finally. Joanna nodded. Quickly, if possible. Quickly, Varys agreed. He rose to leave, then paused. Lady Joanna, you are asking me to trust your judgment over my own assessment of what the realm requires. I want you to understand that I recognize that is what I am doing. I know, Joanna said. I am asking you to do it because I believe I am right and because the alternative is significantly worse. Those are the same reasons I always ask anyone to trust my judgment. She looked at him. Have I been wrong yet? Varys considered this with apparent sincerity. No, he said, not yet. Then we proceed. He left. Joanna sat alone in the tower's study with the candle burning between her and the darkness outside, and she thought about everything she had built over 20 years. The network, the relationships, the careful architecture of influence and information and trust. And she thought about whether it was sufficient for what was coming. The succession question. Littlefinger's scheme, the winter deepening in the north, the wall groaning in 3 places where the magic was failing, the Night King's army growing in the dark beyond the edge of the known world. She had managed Varys. She would manage Stannis. She would manage Littlefinger if it came to that, though Littlefinger was the variable she trusted least. It's the one whose behavior was most contingent on the specific pressures applied to him. What she could not manage was the cold, but she could make sure that when it came, When it finally arrived in the south and the lords could no longer dismiss it as northern exaggeration, she had positioned the realm to face it with something approaching unity rather than fragmentation. She extinguished the candle and went to find her husband. There was work to do, and the night was dark and full of terrors, and the morning would require her to be ready. Varys's intelligence on Stannis Baratheon arrived in pieces, as all good intelligence did, not as a single revelation, but as an accumulation of details that assembled themselves into a picture, the way mosaic tiles assembled themselves into an image. In only recognizable and full once enough pieces were in place. The picture, when complete, was this. Stannis had been corresponding with a maester named Cresson, his own maester at Dragonstone, loyal and aging and deeply uncomfortable with what his lord had asked him to investigate, about the genealogical records of House Baratheon and House Lannister, going back 3 generations. He had been receiving, through a ship captain named Sir Axel Florent, who was his wife's uncle, and therefore available for sensitive commissions, copies of documents from the Citadel's public records regarding the dominant traits of Lannister blood. He had compiled a personal document. Varys had not seen it, but his little birds had heard it described by a Dragonstone servant who cleaned Stannis' study. That was apparently several pages long and methodically structured in the way that all of Stannis' personal documents were methodically structured. He had not yet acted on it. This was the crucial variable. Stannis had the information, or enough of it, to construct a case, but he had not sent ravens to the other lords, had not approached Robert directly, had not done any of the things that his next logical step would require. Varys's assessment, delivered to Joanna with the careful hedging of a man who respected the limits of inference, was that Stannis was still deciding. Not whether what he believed was true. Stannis, once convinced of a fact, did not revisit the conviction, but what his duty required him to do about it. Forna, this was the window. It was not a large window, but Joanna had spent 20 years learning to do significant work through small windows. She went to Dragonstone herself. Tywin did not want her to go. This was not sentimentality. Tywin was not, at his core, sentimental about much, but the rational objection of a man who understood that sending his wife personally to Stannis Baratheon's seat to manage a succession crisis was a move that, if it went wrong, left no plausible deniability. Joanna acknowledged the objection completely and went anyway, because deniability was not the priority, and she was the only person she trusted to read Stannis correctly in a live conversation. She traveled with a small retinue and a cover story of sufficient plausibility. She was visiting to personally thank Lord Stannis for his cooperation in the matter of the dragon glass, a gesture of noble courtesy that was sufficiently mundane to be believable. Stannis received the explanation with the expression he wore when he found something implausible but could not immediately prove it false. Dragonstone was an uncomfortable castle. It had always been an uncomfortable castle. Built by Targaryens for Targaryens, shaped in the image of dragons and ancient Valyrian aesthetic rather than any human consideration of habitability. The stone itself seemed to absorb cold rather than repel it. Wandering in the sea wind came through the dragon-carved corridors with the insistence of something that had been doing it for centuries and saw no reason to stop. The great hall, where Stannis received her, smelled of salt and old stone, and the particular austerity of a man who had stripped away every comfort he could find on the grounds that comfort was a form of weakness. Stannis himself looked exactly like what he was, a man carrying a very heavy moral weight and finding the carrying of it neither easier nor more difficult than he had anticipated, because he had anticipated it being hard and had decided to bear it anyway, and that decision was now what he was. "Lady Joanna," he said, with the courtesy that was always technically correct and never warm, "you have traveled far for a diplomatic nicety." "I have traveled far for a conversation," Joanna said. "The diplomatic nicety is the reason I could give anyone who asked. The conversation is the reason I actually came." She sat down without waiting for an invitation, because Stannis was a man who respected directness and would receive the gesture as appropriate rather than presumptuous. "I think you know what the conversation is about." Stannis looked at her for a long moment with gray eyes that were, she had always thought, the most honest eyes in Westeros. Not because he was without guile, but because he was without the ability to pretend he didn't see what he saw. I know what you believe it's about. Then let us speak plainly, Joanna said. You have been researching the genealogy of Lannister bloodlines. While you have reached conclusions about the parentage of the royal children, you have not yet acted on those conclusions. She folded her hands in her lap. I am here to have the conversation that should happen before you do. The silence in the great hall was the silence of a man deciding whether to have a conversation or to end it. The sea outside moved against Dragonstone's foundations with patient, geological persistence. A torch in the wall bracket guttered in a draft from somewhere and steadied again. You are asking me to ignore what I know, Stannis said. His voice was flat, not angry. Flat was worse than angry, with Stannis. It meant the decision was already made, and he was simply processing the mechanics. I am asking you to weigh what you know against what you know about everything else, Joanna said. Which is a different thing. She looked at him steadily. You sent the dragonglass. You read Lord Commander Mormont's ravens. You are a man who takes the Night's Watch seriously because you are a man who takes duty seriously. And the Night's Watch's duty is the oldest duty in Westeros. She paused. What happens to that duty if you act now? The succession is a political question, Joanna said. The Long Night is an existential one. These are not equivalent concerns, and treating them as equivalent is a failure of prioritization that I do not believe you are capable of, because you are the most rigorously logical man I have encountered in 20 years of encountering powerful men. She held his gaze. If you act now, if you send ravens to the lords of Westeros with what you have concluded, Robert will not accept it. Robert will react, and his reaction will not be measured. The realm will fracture. We will have another war at exactly the moment when the wall needs the realm's unified attention and resources, and when the Night's Watch has finally, after 15 years of effort, begun to receive what it needs. She let that sit for a moment. You will have been right about the succession, and you will have been catastrophically wrong about the timing, and the second error will cost more lives than the first error ever could. Stannis was quiet. This was different from his usual quiet. Not the quiet of a man who had already decided and was simply not yet speaking, but the quiet of a man actually processing a new argument against a position he had already formed. This was, Joanna knew, the most she could hope for from Stannis Baratheon. He did not change his conclusions easily or often, but he was, underneath the rigidity, genuinely rational, and genuine rationality was workable. You are asking me to delay, he said finally, not to abandon. I am asking you to delay, Joanna confirmed, until the North is addressed, until the wall is secure, until we know whether the long night is coming and have done what can be done to prepare for it. She paused. After that, if we are all still here to have the conversation, I will not stand between you and whatever you believe your duty requires. I give you my word. Your word, Stannis said, with the specific inflection of a man assessing the value of currency he is unfamiliar with. My word, Joanna said, which I have not, in 20 years of giving it, broken. What you may verify this with anyone who has received it. She looked at him. I am not asking you to trust me because I am a Lannister. I am asking you to trust me because I am the person who has spent the last 5 years working to prepare this realm for a threat that everyone else is still dismissing. And the arithmetic of that preparation requires the realm to remain intact long enough for the preparation to matter. Another silence. Stannis rose and moved to the window that looked out over the gray sea, standing with his hands clasped behind his back, in the posture of a man thinking through a position he has held and is not yet ready to release. The sea moved. The wind came through the ancient stones. The document I have compiled, he said without turning from the window, it will be kept at Dragonstone, sealed, yet not destroyed. I will not destroy evidence of what I believe to be true, but sealed and not acted upon until the northern situation is resolved, or until I determine that continued delay constitutes a moral failure I cannot accept. He turned. Those are my terms. Joanna assessed them. They were, given what she had come here hoping for, better than she had anticipated. Stannis had given her time. Not unconditional time, Stannis was incapable of unconditional anything, but time with clear parameters, which was time she could work within. I accept your terms, she said, and I will ensure that you receive complete intelligence on the northern situation as it develops. Not summaries. Complete reports, including Tyrion's personal correspondence from his time at the Wall. She paused. Amraya, you should know what you are protecting the succession for. Something moved in Stannis's expression that was not quite warmth, but was the closest approximation his face typically managed. A slight easing of the permanent tension, an acknowledgement of something recognized. You have been taking this seriously from the beginning, he said. It was not quite a question. Since my son's first letter from the Wall, Joanna said. Yes. Most people have not. Most people, Joanna said, are managing the problems they can see with the tools they have, and hoping the problems they can't see will remain invisible. She stood. I have never found hope to be a reliable strategic asset. She stayed at Dragonstone for 2 days, long enough to make the diplomatic courtesy plausible, and short enough not to attract the specific kind of attention that long visits between politically complicated parties attracted. She dined with Stannis and his wife Selyse, who was a woman of fervent religious conviction and limited political imagination, and with Maester Cresson, who was old and gentle and clearly uncomfortable with everything that had been happening around him for the past year. She was courteous to all of them and learned several things that had not been in Varys's intelligence, because Varys's little birds were very good at hearing what was said and not always as good at observing what was felt. What she felt from Dragonstone, underneath the political complexity of Stannis's dilemma, was the Red Priestess. She had arrived 6 months prior, a woman named Melisandre, from Ashai, red-robed and utterly certain in the way that genuinely faithful people were certain and the way that dangerous people sometimes used faith as armor. Selyse had embraced the Lord of Light with the convert's intensity. Stannis was more measured in his response to the Red Woman, but was clearly being influenced in ways that Cresson, who was worried and did not hide it well, found alarming. Joanna had one conversation with Melisandre, brief and carefully managed. The Red Woman looked at her with the flame-lit eyes of someone who claimed to see things in fire that others could not, and said, You burn brightly, Lady Lannister. The Lord's flames show me someone who has been holding back a darkness with her bare hands. The Lord's flames are poetic, Joanna said pleasantly. I prefer correspondence and careful planning. Less dramatic, aye, but more reliable. Melisandre smiled with the serenity of someone who found limited perspective objections charming rather than challenging. The night that is coming will require more than correspondence. Yes, Joanna said, which is why I am also pursuing the Dragonglass and the Wall's restoration and the Night's Watch's resupply. The correspondence is how I pursue those things. She looked at the Red Woman steadily. I do not object to the Lord of Light, my lady. I object to certainty as a substitute for preparation. Prophecy tells you what is coming. It does not build the walls. She left Dragonstone with Stannis's sealed terms and a new variable she had not fully accounted for. The Red religion, expanding from its eastern roots into the heart of Westerosi politics through the specific vector of Stannis Baratheon's unyielding sense of destiny. Melisandre believed Stannis was Azor Ahai reborn, the prince who was promised, the Lord of Light's instrument against the long night. This belief would shape Stannis's behavior in ways that pure political calculation could not predict, because prophecy introduced a variable that rationality could not control. It gave a man reasons to act that existed outside the normal cost-benefit analysis of political decision-making. She would need to watch this carefully. She filed it alongside everything else she was watching carefully. In the specific mental architecture she had built over 20 years for holding multiple complex situations in simultaneous focus without losing the thread of any of them. The journey back to King's Landing took 8 days, and she spent most of it in her cabin, reading and writing and thinking through the next sequence of moves with the methodical attention of a woman who understood that the board had just changed in ways that would take time to fully map. She had managed Stannis. She had not solved him. Stannis was not solvable in the way that genuinely principled people are not solvable, because their principles are not negotiating positions, but load-bearing structures. But she had bought time, and time was what she needed. And she had bought it at the cost of a promise that she intended to keep because breaking it would cost more than keeping it. She arrived at King's Landing to find two things waiting for her. The first was a raven from Tyrion, now back in the city and installed in chambers at the Tower of the Hand, that were too small for his growing library, but that he had arranged with the particular efficiency of someone who had learned at the Wall that inadequate space was not a reason to be disorganized. His raven said, "The Wall's structural weaknesses have worsened." Noy's latest report from a contact in the Watch, a ranger who went north and returned, which is rarer than it should be, indicates that the area beyond Eastwatch by the sea is showing signs of accelerated activity. The cold is moving differently. He says it feels directional. On the second was a message from Littlefinger, delivered in the polished, social form of a dinner invitation, which she read as a communication of different intent than its surface suggested. The timing, immediately upon her return from Dragonstone, which he should not have known about with such precision, confirmed what she had suspected. Littlefinger had someone at Dragonstone. She accepted the dinner invitation. She informed Varys of this and asked him to identify Littlefinger's Dragonstone source with whatever urgency his network permitted. She wrote back to Tyrion with specific questions about Eastwatch's ranger reports. She sent a raven to Mormont asking for his current assessment of the timeline. Then she went to find Tywin because there were decisions ahead that she could not make without him. However, and decisions made together were decisions that held. He was in his study, working by candlelight, with the focused intensity of a man for whom work was the most natural state of being. He looked up when she entered, and something in her expression— she was usually better at managing what her face said, but she was tired from the journey, and the weight of what she was carrying was, today, briefly visible— made him set down his pen. "Tell me," he said. She told him. All of it. Stannis's terms, Melisandre's arrival, Littlefinger's Dragonstone source, Tyrion's raven about Eastwatch. She told it plainly and in order, the way she always organized information for Tywin, knowing that he received it best when it was structured rather than narrative. When she finished, the candle between them had burned noticeably lower. Tywin was quiet for a moment, with the stillness of a man compressing a very large amount of calculation into a very small amount of time. "Littlefinger needs to be removed from the Master of Coin position," he said. "Yes," Joanna said, "but carefully. Abruptly removing him creates an enemy who is currently a manageable problem. We need a reason that appears organic." "Everything appears organic if you give it enough time," Tywin said. "We don't have unlimited time." "No," Joanna agreed. "We don't." She looked at her husband across the candle. "The cold is moving, Tywin. Tyrion says it feels directional. The Wall is weakening. Whatever has been waiting beyond it is beginning to move. And we have a succession crisis brewing in Dragonstone and a schemer in our small council who will use both to his advantage if we give him the chance." Tywin looked at her with the expression that contained, for those who knew how to read it, what passed in him for acknowledgement of genuine difficulty. "What do you need?" It was the question he had been asking her, in one form or another, for 30 years. What do you need? Not, what should we do? Which implied shared deliberation. Not, what do you suggest? Which implied his authority over her counsel. What do you need? The specific question of a man who had understood, through 30 years of marriage, that the most efficient path to a correct decision was often to ask the person who had already thought it through what conclusion they had reached and what resources they required to execute it. She told him what she needed. He listened. He raised two objections, both of which she addressed. He modified one element of the plan with a suggestion that was, she acknowledged, better than what she had proposed. Then he nodded, which was Tywin's version of complete agreement. They sat together for a moment in the candlelight before the work resumed, with the particular companionship of people who have been building something together for a very long time, and have reached the part of the project where the stakes are highest and the foundation they have laid is either sufficient or it isn't. Outside the tower's window, the winter deepened. The stars were very clear and very cold. Somewhere north of the Wall, in the darkness beyond the edge of the known world, something ancient had begun to move with the slow, terrible patience of a thing that had been waiting for 8,000 years and had finally decided that it had waited long enough. The long night was not coming, it was here. The first confirmation that the long night had begun in earnest did not come from a raven. Ravens required someone alive to send them. It came instead from a survivor, a single brother of the Night's Watch named Edison Tollet, called Dolorous Ed by his brothers for the particular quality of his outlook on human existence, who arrived at Castle Black's gates on a horse that had been ridden past the point of endurance and then ridden further, with the expression of a man who had seen something that had permanently reorganized his understanding of what the world was capable of. He had been part of a ranging party of 12. He was the only one who had returned, and he had returned missing 2 fingers on his left hand to frostbite and carrying a wound on his right side that the maester packed with poultices in genuine alarm. Lord Commander Mormont sent a raven to King's Landing within the hour. It arrived 9 days later, and it was on Joanna's desk before it reached anyone else, because 14 years of arrangement made this reliable. She read it once. Then she went to find Tyrion, who was in the tower's library, engaged in what he described as a critical cross-referencing project and what she assessed as an elaborate avoidance of a conversation he sensed was coming. "I've read this," she said, setting the raven on top of his books. He read it. His expression, which he usually managed with the care of someone who had learned that visible reaction was a liability, moved through several things quickly. When he finished, he set it down carefully, as though the paper itself required handling. "Ed Tollet," he said. "I know him. Steady man, not given to exaggeration." He paused. 12 rangers. Yes. 1 survivor. Yes. Tyrion was quiet for a moment. The army of the dead crossed the Milkwater 4 days before Ed's ranging party encountered them. That puts them approximately, he calculated with the automatic speed of a mind that had been doing nothing but thinking about this problem for 2 years, 90 miles south of where the last ranging reports placed their position 3 months ago. "That rate of advance, if it holds, gives us 8 weeks, Joanna said, before they reach the wall. The silence in the library had a different quality than ordinary silence. It was the silence of a number that was real rather than theoretical. "The wall will hold," Tyrion said, but the way he said it carried the specific inflection of a man who was not certain and was aware that he was not certain. "The dragon glass, the additional brothers, the structural repairs Noy implemented in the 3-week sections. "The wall will slow them," Joanna said. "Whether it holds depends on variables we don't fully control." She sat down across from him. "We need to move the court's attention north now. Not in weeks. Now. And while there is still time to mobilize forces that can reinforce the watch and create a defensive position south of the wall, if the wall fails." She looked at her son steadily. "I need you to present the intelligence to the small council this morning. Not tonight, this morning." Tyrion looked at her with the expression of a man who understood what she was asking and was already calculating how to do it most effectively. "Robert." "I will handle Robert," Joanna said. "You handle the council." She had been preparing for this moment for 5 years, in the way that a careful architect prepares for the moment when the building must bear its design load. Not certain when the load would come, but certain that when it did, the preparation would either be sufficient or it wouldn't, and there was no middle ground. The network, the intelligence, the dragon glass at Castle Black, the restored sections of the wall, the additional brothers recruited through 3 years of crown pressure on reluctant lords, the quiet campaign of northern awareness she had run through her correspondence. All of it was about to be tested against the reality of something that had been waiting 8,000 years and was no longer waiting. Robert received the news in his solar with Joanna present and Tyrion standing at the window with a copy of Mormont's Raven, and his reaction went through 3 distinct phases in rapid succession. The first was dismissal, Robert's instinctive response to information that disrupted his current priorities, which involved a hunting trip he had been planning for a fortnight. The second was something Joanna had been waiting for without knowing if it would come. A genuine flicker of the man Robert had been before the throne had finished its long work of reducing him, the soldier and commander who had won a rebellion through personal courage and tactical intelligence, and who had, underneath the drinking and the hunting and the systematic avoidance of everything that felt like grief, never entirely lost his instinct for the real threat among the presented ones. The third phase was anger, but it was a useful anger, directed outward at the situation at the 8,000 years of Westerosi political failure that had let the Night's Watch decline to this, at the masters who had spent decades dismissing what the Rangers were reporting. When it was the anger of a man who had been inadequately prepared for something and was placing the blame correctly on the preparation rather than incorrectly on the information. "How long have you known?" he said to Joanna. "Since Tyrion returned from the Wall 2 years ago," she said. "We have been working since then to position the realm to respond." "You should have told me immediately." "I told you through stories at dinner for 6 months," Joanna said, with the measured honesty she had always found worked better with Robert than diplomacy. "The histories of the Long Night, the Night King, the Last Hero. You enjoyed them. The difficulty was the gap between enjoying the story and believing the history." She held his gaze. "I needed you to believe the history before I brought you a raven that required immediate action. Our king who acts immediately on information he doesn't believe is a king who reverses course when the belief wavers. I needed the belief first." Robert stared at her for a long moment. "That is the most manipulative thing anyone has ever explained to me honestly." "Yes," Joanna said. "I apologize for the necessity. Do you believe it now?" Robert looked at Mormont's raven, at Tyrion's supporting documents, at the intelligence accumulated over 2 years that Joanna laid before him in the next hour, with the methodical precision of someone presenting a case she had been building for exactly this moment. He asked questions, good questions, the questions of a military mind engaging with a military problem, which was always where Robert was most himself. When she finished, he said, "We ride north." "The crown rides north," Joanna said carefully, "with a force sufficient to reinforce the wall and establish a defensive position, and with the lords of the realm summoned to contribute men under the crown's authority. Not a punitive expedition, a defensive mobilization." "The lords won't come," Robert said. "Half of them still think this is wildling stories." "The lords will come when the king commands it," Tywin said from the doorway, where he had been standing for the last 20 minutes. Joanna had sent for him at the conversation's beginning, timing his arrival for the moment when Robert had processed the information sufficiently to be ready for Tywin's particular form of follow-through. "And when they arrive at the wall and see what is there, the ones who doubted will not doubt again." The ravens went out that afternoon, 43 ravens to 43 lords, and carrying the king's seal in Tywin's language and Joanna's careful framing. Specific enough to compel, restrained enough not to produce the kind of panic that made lords lock their gates rather than march their armies. She had written 4 different versions of the letter and selected the one that balanced urgency and authority most effectively, which had required knowing her audience well enough to anticipate how each version would land with different temperaments. She knew her audience. Ned Stark's response arrived in 6 days, faster than any other, because Ned Stark had been taking the Watch's ravens seriously for 3 years and had men partially provisioned and ready. His letter was characteristically direct. The North remembers what the South has forgotten. Winterfell's forces march in 3 days, when the wall will not fall, while a Stark can stand before it. Joanna read this with the complicated warmth she had always felt for Ned Stark, that combination of genuine respect for his integrity and genuine concern for his survival in situations that punished integrity, and she wrote back immediately. "Lord Stark, the dragon glass. Ensure your men carry it. Every man who goes north of the wall or stands at its base must be armed with it. This is not a suggestion." Stannis' response arrived 7 days after that, and it was, characteristically, a single page. He was coming. He was bringing 4,000 men from Dragonstone and the Stormlands. He was also bringing Melisandre, which Joanna had anticipated and was prepared to manage as a complicating variable. And the Lords of the Reach were slower. The Tyrell's response carried the particular hedging quality of people who were calculating what their participation would cost against what their refusal would cost, and who had not yet fully updated their threat model to account for an army of the dead. Joanna sent a personal letter to Lady Olenna Tyrell, which was a different exercise than sending a letter to Lord Mace. Olenna was the actual decision-maker in Highgarden, had been for 30 years, and engaging her directly was more efficient than the performance of engaging her son. The letter was brief and specific and contained in its final paragraph in a sentence that Olenna would recognize as the kind of sentence that contained more information than its words technically conveyed. The things coming from the north do not distinguish between roses and lions. They have no concept of Highgarden's position, or the Reach's wealth, or the value of careful neutrality. They have one concept, and it is very cold. Olenna's response arrived within a week. The Reach would send 10,000 men. The letter was addressed to Lady Joanna rather than to the king or the Hand, which was itself a communication of something that Joanna received without comment and with genuine appreciation. Littlefinger was the problem she had been circling. He had attended the small council meeting where Tyrion presented the intelligence. Yes, and he had listened with the expression she most distrusted from him, the expression of a man doing several calculations simultaneously and not revealing which one was primary. He had not objected to the mobilization. He had offered, with the helpful efficiency of a master of coin who understood logistics, specific suggestions about the financing of the Crown's contribution to the Northern campaign. The suggestions were genuinely good, which made them more suspicious than obviously self-serving suggestions would have been. She had found his Dragonstone source through Varys 3 days after returning from her visit, a steward in Lord Stannis's household who supplemented his wages with information sold to various parties, which was common enough among the serving class and not the steward's most interesting quality. His most interesting quality was that he had been placed in Stannis's household 6 years prior by arrangement, and the arrangement traced back, through 3 intermediaries, to Petyr Baelish. Littlefinger had known about Stannis's investigation from before it began. He had possibly known about it because he had encouraged it. In the subtle way he encouraged all chaos, not by starting the fire, but by ensuring the kindling was positioned correctly, and then being elsewhere when the spark arrived. She had this conversation with Tywin the evening before the court's departure north, sitting in the Tower of the Hand, for what she recognized might be the last time in its current form, because the world that was coming toward them from the north was the kind of world that rearranged everything it touched. Littlefinger cannot come north with us, she said. He cannot be in a position to use the chaos of the campaign, the shifting lord loyalties, the fear, the desperate decisions that war forces, to advance whatever he's building. He holds the Crown's finances, Tywin said. He holds the Crown's finances in King's Landing, Joanna said. Leave him in King's Landing, with specific responsibilities that keep him occupied and specific oversight that limits what he can do outside those responsibilities. She paused. Varys stays too, with instructions to watch Littlefinger specifically and with authority to act if the watching produces findings that require action. She looked at Tywin. They will be miserable together and productive for us. That is the arrangement. Tywin considered it. Varys won't like being left behind. Varys will understand the reasoning, Joanna said. He serves the realm. The realm's most critical need in King's Landing during the Northern campaign is someone managing the political situation. He will recognize this as the correct deployment. She paused. I'll speak with him before we leave. She did. Varys received the assignment with the expression of a man who had arrived at the same conclusion independently and was confirming rather than receiving new information. He also received, in the same conversation, something she had been holding for the right moment. Complete documentation of what she knew about Littlefinger's activities over the past 5 years, organized and specific and sufficient to act on if action became necessary. Varys looked at the documents for a long moment. Yeah, you've had this for how long? Most of it for 2 years, Joanna said. Some of it longer. And you held it. I held it until I needed it, Joanna said. Weapons deployed too early are weapons that can't be used again. Littlefinger as a managed threat is more useful than Littlefinger as an exposed and therefore desperate one. She looked at the spider steadily. He becomes dangerous when cornered. I have been ensuring he was never quite cornered, only constrained. You are now the constraint. Varys looked at her with the expression that was, she had come to understand over years of working with him, his version of genuine respect. A slight widening of the eyes, a fractional dropping of the performed affect, something more real underneath. I will manage him, he said. And if he cannot be managed, then use what I've given you, Joanna said, with proportionate force and complete documentation, no more than necessary. She left King's Landing 3 days later with Tywin at her side, and Tyrion riding ahead to coordinate with Mormont on the wall's defensive preparations. The column that rode north was the largest military mobilization since Robert's rebellion. The king's personal guard, the Lannister army, the advance riders from Ned Stark's force that had integrated smoothly in the way that forces integrate when they are genuinely aligned on objective rather than merely politically allied. The road north was cold and getting colder, the kind of cold that arrived in your bones before it arrived in your awareness, the kind that the Northerners recognized and the Southerners were just beginning to learn. Robert rode at the column's head with a specific quality of aliveness that he had not shown in years, a purpose that fit him the way a sword fit a man who had been carrying administrative burdens instead, something that engaged all of him rather than only the part that could tolerate governance. Joanna watched him from her position in the column's middle and felt the complicated warmth she had always felt for Robert Baratheon. That combination of affection for the man and recognition of the king's failures and acknowledgement that he had been, at his core, made for exactly this kind of moment. She hoped it would be sufficient. She had done everything she could to ensure that this moment, when it came, would find the realm prepared rather than fractured. The dragon glass was at the wall. The watch had been resupplied. Stannis was coming from the south. Ned Stark was already marching. The Reach's 10,000 would arrive within 3 weeks. Whether it was enough depended on variables she had not been able to control. The wall's structural integrity, the Night King's pace, the specific capabilities of what waited beyond the ice in the blue-black dark. She had bought the realm every advantage preparation could provide. What came next would be won or lost in the space between preparation and reality, in the gap where planning ended and the actual world began. The wall appeared on the horizon on the 14th day of marching, and even from that distance, even for someone who had been studying it in correspondence for 5 years, the sight of it was arresting. 700 feet of ancient ice rising against the gray sky like the edge of the world turned vertical. The men around her went quiet when they saw it, the particular quiet of people encountering something whose scale their imagination had not adequately captured. Joanna looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked past it, at the darkness beyond its northern face, where the sky met the ice in a line that was, today, slightly darker than it should have been, slightly more opaque, as though the darkness there had a texture and a depth that ordinary darkness lacked. Something was on the other side. Something had been on the other side for 8,000 years. She urged her horse forward because the wall was not the destination. The wall was where the work began. The wall held, not easily, not without cost, not in the clean, decisive way that songs would later describe, because songs were made by people who had not been present and who needed the truth to be simpler than it was in order to carry it in a melody. The wall held the way things hold when they were built for exactly this moment and have been waiting 8,000 years to be needed, with a terrible, grinding, ancient authority that had nothing to do with the men standing at its top, and everything to do with what the men who built it had understood about the nature of the darkness they were containing. But men mattered too. This was what the histories had always argued, and what the Long Night's arrival confirmed. The wall's magic was not independent of human commitment to it. Aemon had been right. The oath meant something beyond its words. The brothers who stood at the wall's top in the first 3 days of the assault, when the army of the dead reached the ice and began its pressure against the base, with the mindless, inexhaustible patience of a force that did not tire, and did not fear, and did not calculate losses. Those brothers held because they had chosen to hold, and their choosing was part of what the wall's ancient construction required. Tyrion had understood this before anyone else, and had spent the weeks before the army's arrival working with Mormont and Noy on the specific deployment of the Watch's brothers and the Crown's forces to maximize what the dragonglass could do at the wall's base. The caches of dragonglass weapons, tipped arrows, short spears, and the knives that Noy had developed through trial and error, were distributed with the precise logic of a man who had read every account of the Long Night's first iteration and cross-referenced them against the specific tactical situation at Castle Black. Not spread evenly, concentrated at the 3 structural weak points that Tyrion had identified on his first visit, because those were the points where the wall's magical integrity was lowest and therefore where the pressure of the army of the dead would be most effective. He had been right about the weak points. The army of the dead found them within the first 6 hours, with the specific intelligence of a force directed by something that understood the wall's construction at a level that implied either ancient memory or direct knowledge. The Night King did not appear immediately. Who this was, Tyrion noted to Mormont with the specific quality of calm that extremely frightened intelligent people sometimes achieved. Itself significant information. The Night King's power was the raising of the dead, and the army currently pressing the wall's base represented the accumulated dead of centuries of ranging beyond it. Deploying that army without the Night King's direct presence meant either that the Night King was conserving something, or that he had a different objective than the wall's destruction. He reported this to Joanna, who was positioned at the wall's base in the command structure they had established, a coordination point where the military intelligence from the wall's top, from the ranging scouts south of the army's position, and from Stannis's force that had arrived from the east 3 days prior, could be assembled into coherent situational awareness. She read Tyrion's assessment and immediately thought through its implications. "He's looking for something," she said to Ned Stark, who was standing at the command table with the map spread before them, and the sounds of the wall's defense audible even here. A distant percussion of fire and breaking ice, and human voices doing what human voices do when they are doing the hardest thing they have ever done. Ned looked at her with the directness she had always respected in him. "The three-eyed raven," he said. "Bran." Joanna had not known about Bran Stark's abilities until 3 weeks prior, when Ned had told her with the specific expression of a father carrying something enormous and uncertain about whether the carrying was right or wrong. His youngest son, crippled in a fall, had been developing abilities that the Masters had no framework for: green-seeing, warging, the capacity to move through the weirwood network in ways that the historical accounts of the Children of the Forest described, but that no living person had been documented as achieving. Bran was at Winterfell. He was 10 years old, and something about him was visible, apparently, to the Night King in a way that nothing else was. "Then Winterfell needs to be," Joanna began. "I have sent for him," Ned said. "He is being brought south, away from the weirwood network that the Night King can use to find him." He paused. "Lady Joanna, I need to tell you something about my son's abilities that I have not put in writing," he told her. She listened with the full attention she gave everything that mattered, and when he finished she was quiet for a moment that contained the adjustment of a very large number of assumptions to account for new information. Bran Stark could see through time, not metaphorically. Literally, he could access the weirwood network's accumulated memory of everything that had ever happened within sight of a heart tree, going back to the dawn of the first men. He had been seeing, in increasing clarity over the past year, the original Long Night, the Night King's creation, the specific event 8,000 years prior, when the Children of the Forest had driven a dragon glass blade into a man's heart to create a weapon against the first men, and had instead created the first White Walker, and the weapon had turned. He had also seen, in the weirwood's accumulated memory, something about the Night King's nature that the histories had recorded incorrectly or incompletely. Not an immortal force of pure destruction, but a created thing, a human being transformed, carrying within his transformation the specific vulnerability that all created things carried. The method of their creation was also the method of their unmaking. Dragon glass to the heart, not a dragon glass arrow or a dragon glass spear or a dragon glass knife swung in battle. A specific act at the Night King himself, in the specific way the Children of the Forest had originally made him. The army of the dead was secondary. The whites were secondary. Everything was secondary to reaching the Night King and destroying what had been made by reversing the making. Joanna absorbed this and then said, with the precision of someone moving from information to action without allowing the weight of what she had just learned to slow the movement, "Who can reach him?" Ned was quiet for a moment. "He will come to Bran," he said. "Whatever he is looking for, whatever draws him toward the three-eyed raven, he will come personally for it, which means he will come to wherever Bran is." "Then Bran becomes the trap," Joanna said. Not callously. She understood what she was saying, understood that she was discussing a 10-year-old child as a tactical element, and when she did not say it without the full weight of that understanding sitting on every word. With every protection we can provide, and every weapon we have available, and every person we can position around him. She looked at Ned steadily. Is this something you can accept? Ned Stark looked at her with the gray eyes that had always seen clearly, and paid the full price of clear seeing. He is my son, he said. Yes, Joanna said, and you are his father, which means the decision is yours and I will not take it from you. She paused. But I need to know, Lord Stark, because if we are going to do this, we need time to prepare it correctly, and time is the variable that is moving against us. The silence between them lasted long enough to carry everything it needed to carry. Then Ned said, prepare it. Or I will speak with Bran. What followed was 4 days of preparation conducted against the background of the wall's defense, which held through those 4 days with the grinding, costly endurance that Tyrion had predicted and Mormont had organized, and the brothers of the Night's Watch made real through the simple, unrepeatable act of continuing to stand at their post. The dragon glass weapons took their toll on the whites that tested the wall's base. The fire that Robert personally organized, massive signal fires built along the wall's southern face, fed by the Reach's supply wagons and burning with the particular intensity of a man who had found at last a war he understood how to fight, lit the night and pushed the cold back to a manageable distance. Stannis arrived from the east with his 4,000 and Melisandre beside him. Amren and the Red Priestess moved through the camp's perimeter in the firelight with the specific authority of someone who had been waiting for this moment with the full weight of genuine faith. Her fires burned differently than the ordinary fires, hotter, more stable, resistant to the cold in ways that the ordinary fires weren't, which Tyrion noted and reported to Joanna with the specific comment that he was revising his prior skepticism about R'hllor's literal power in light of empirical evidence. Joanna spoke with Melisandre once during those 4 days, briefly and with the directness she used when directness was the only tool that would work. Whatever you see in your fires, she said, on whatever Stannis' role in it, I need you to understand that this plan requires specific timing, and I need you to support that timing rather than act on prophecy independently. Melisandre looked at her with the flame-lit certainty that was her permanent expression. The Lord of Light's timing and your timing may not be the same. Then we will discover that when it happens, Joanna said. Until then, I am asking you to trust that the people who have been preparing for this for 5 years have thought about the timing. She paused. I am not asking you to abandon your faith. I am asking you to extend it to the possibility that your God works through preparation as well as prophecy. Something moved in Melisandre's expression that was not agreement, but was adjacent to it. A fractional acknowledgement that the argument had some validity. Sir, the princess who was promised, she said almost to herself, looking at Joanna with the specific quality of someone seeing something in a person that the person cannot see in themselves. I am nobody's promised anything, Joanna said pleasantly. I am a woman who has been paying close attention. Come. Bran arrived at the wall on the 5th day, carried in the device his brother Jon had helped build, a basket arrangement that allowed him to be transported on horseback. With the specific expression of a child who had seen more in his 10 years than most people saw in a full life, and had arrived at a place beyond ordinary fear, in the territory where clarity lived. He looked at Joanna when they met with the disconcerting directness of someone who knew things about the people they were looking at that those people didn't know about themselves. You have held things together, he said, with the matter-of-fact quality of an observation rather than a compliment. I have tried, Joanna said. How much do you understand about what we need from you? I understand everything, Bran said. I've seen it. He paused. The Night King will come when he knows where I am. He won't send the army first. He'll come himself because what he wants is what I carry. The memory, the Weirwood's memory of everything. He thinks if he destroys the three-eyed raven, the memory dies with it. He looked at her with the calm of someone reporting information rather than living it. He's wrong about that, but he doesn't know he's wrong. Good, Joanna said. That is what we are relying on. The Night King came on the 7th night. Not with his army, They continued their pressure on the wall's base, relentless and patient. But the Night King himself moved differently. He came from the east, away from the main army, approaching the wall at a point 3 miles from Castle Black, where the sentries were positioned, but where the wall's height was slightly less. One of the three structural weaknesses, the ones Tyrion had identified years ago, the ones where the magic was thinnest. He came through the cold with the specific presence of something very old, moving with complete confidence. Because 8,000 years of existence produced a particular kind of certainty about one's own power. He was not expecting what he found. He was expecting a child and perhaps a handful of guards, positioned as bait with the predictable tactical logic of people who understood the concept of a trap, but not the concept of a Night King. He was expecting to take what he came for and withdraw. He found Ned Stark and Robert Baratheon and Stannis Baratheon standing in a line with dragonglass weapons, and Jon Snow, Ned's ward, 17 years old, who had been training for the Night's Watch and had the specific quality of stillness that Rangers developed, combined with something else, some quality that the Night King's ancient awareness registered with the specific attention of recognition, standing slightly ahead of them. And he found Joanna Lannister standing to the side of this formation with no weapon, which was correct, because her weapon was the formation itself and the plan that had assembled it. What followed was not clean. Nothing in the long night was clean. Robert fought with the desperate, total commitment of a man who had been looking for a fight worthy of him for 15 years, and he was still the most physically formidable man in Westeros, and he made the Night King pay attention to him in a way that was both tactically necessary and personally costly. Stannis fought with the rigid, total discipline of a man who had decided this was what his duty required, and who did not flinch from duty regardless of what it asked. Ned fought the way Ned Stark always fought, honestly without flourish, with the full commitment of someone who had never learned to fight any other way. The Night King was not killable by any of them. When he was 8,000 years old and made of death's own material, and dragonglass in a sword wound slowed him, but did not end him. This was known. This was planned for. What was planned for was the moment when the Night King reached Bran, who sat in his carrying frame in the formation's center, eyes open and white with the green sight, present and absent simultaneously in the way of someone occupying 2 times at once, and reached for him with the specific intention of a thing that had come for a specific purpose and was not going to be deflected. Jon Snow was faster, not because of training, though the training was real, because of something in him that the Night King's ancient awareness had registered as recognition, the specific recognition of blood and fire, of something in Jon Snow's lineage that resonated with the cosmological conflict between fire and ice in a way that changed the tactical calculation. The Night King turned toward Jon with the specific attention of something that has recognized a genuine threat rather than a tactical obstacle. And Arya Stark, who had been trained by the faceless men of Braavos, and who moved like water in shadow, and the specific certainty of someone who had decided that death was not the thing to fear, because she had looked at it directly and found it less frightening than the alternative. Arya Stark, whom no one had seen arrive because no one ever saw Arya Stark arrive until she intended to be seen, drove a dragonglass blade into the Night King's heart from behind, carked in the specific manner in the specific location that Bran had seen in the Weirwood's 8,000-year memory of the moment of his making. The sound was not dramatic. This was what everyone who was present would remember afterward, in the private accounts they gave to people they trusted. Not the thunder or the roar they had expected, but a sound like ice cracking in early spring. A single, definitive, structural sound of something that had been under enormous pressure for a very long time, releasing that pressure all at once. The Night King shattered, not metaphorically. He came apart from the point of the blade outward in a wave of ice and cold air that knocked the people nearest to him off their feet. A wave of released winter that was also unmistakably the release of something held. 8,000 years of cold intention collapsing into ordinary cold air. The whites at the wall's base dropped simultaneously, the specific dropping of things whose animating force has been removed, a sound across 3 miles of army that was like a field of broken instruments going silent at once. The wall groaned. All along its length, the groaning of the structural weaknesses Tyrion had identified, the places where the magic had been thinnest, intensified for a moment that was very long, a moment in which everyone present held the specific breath of people waiting to discover if the thing they had built was sufficient. The wall held. In the ringing silence that followed, with the torchlight catching the ice crystals that had been the Night King still settling slowly through the cold air, but Joanna Lannister became aware that she was sitting on the ground, which was unexpected. She did not remember falling. She assessed herself with the quick inventory of someone who has learned to do this automatically, and found that she was unhurt, only displaced by the wave of released cold, sitting in the snow at the base of the wall that had stood for 8,000 years with ice crystals catching the torchlight in her hair. Robert pulled her to her feet with the grip of a man who was bleeding from a wound on his arm and did not appear to have noticed it. "Well," he said, with the specific quality of a man who has just discovered that an old story was true and is not entirely sure what to do with the discovery. "Well, yes," Joanna said. She looked at Bran, Sever, who had emerged from the green site with the slow quality of someone returning from a very long journey, and at Arya, who was cleaning the dragon glass blade with the practical efficiency of someone for whom this was simply a completed task, and at Ned Stark, who was holding his daughter with the specific expression of a father who has allowed his child to do something necessary and dangerous, and is only now allowing himself to feel what that cost. She looked at Tyrion, who was standing to her left with the expression of a man who has spent 5 years being right about something and has just watched being right about it produce an outcome he had not been entirely certain would occur. "I told you," he said, which was not what he said, but was the entire content of his expression. "You told me," she agreed. A dawn came over the wall with the specific quality of a dawn after a long night. Not more beautiful than other dawns, but more noticed, each element of it registering with the heightened attention of people for whom the return of light had briefly been uncertain. The cold did not leave. It was winter, and winter had its own pace. And the end of the long night did not mean the end of winter, but the cold was ordinary cold again. The cold of weather rather than the cold of something ancient and intentional pressing against the world's edge. The ravens went south before the sun was fully up. Joanna wrote the one to King's Landing herself, addressed to Varys, because Varys would need to manage the political situation in the capital with the specific information that the threat was ended, and the specific additional information that the court's return would present a new political landscape that required preparation. She wrote it in her own hand, which she did when the document was important enough to warrant the personal commitment that handwriting represented. She wrote it quickly because there was much to do, and the practice of much to do was the practice of her life. And she had never found the volume of work to be itself the difficulty. The difficulty and the practice and the life was doing it correctly. The wall stood behind her, ancient and sufficient, groaning now only with cold rather than with the strain of holding back something that had finally been held. Below it, the army of the dead lay still in the snow. 10,000 years of accumulated dead returned to their proper state. The long night's army released from its service into the ordinary silence of the ordinary dead. Joanna Lannister looked north, at the vast emptiness beyond the wall where nothing moved now except the wind. And she looked south at the road that led back to King's Landing and the court and Stannis' sealed document at Dragonstone and Littlefinger's patient schemes and the 1,000 political questions that the long night's end had suspended rather than resolved. Both directions required her attention. Both directions always had. She turned south because the wall would stand and the north could wait and the south, as always, could not. There was a Stannis to manage and a succession to think carefully about, when and a son she intended to put on every small council that would have him, and a daughter who had learned, finally, that survival and love were not mutually exclusive if you were careful and clear-eyed and willing to do the hard work of holding both. There was a realm to run. She had been running it for 20 years, from behind the position that the world's formal structures had assigned to her, beside, adjacent to, in the gaps of, and she had found it sufficient. Not just, not fair. but sufficient for the work, which was the only standard she had ever applied to anything. The long night was over. Joanna Lannister rode south into a winter morning, and she was already thinking about what came next. In the years that followed, the maesters of the Citadel would argue, and with a particular passion that scholars reserve for questions they cannot definitively resolve, about the Long Night's defeat. They would cite Robert's courage, Stannis' discipline, Ned Stark's honor, Jon Snow's lineage, Arya's training, the Night's Watch's endurance, the Dragon Glass, the Wall's ancient magic. They would write extensive accounts of the battle and the Night King's fall, and the Army of the Dead's dissolution. In almost none of these accounts did the name Joanna Lannister appear prominently. This did not trouble her. Prominence was for people who needed the acknowledgement because they lacked other compensation. What Joanna had was the knowledge that the realm had survived, that the work had been sufficient, that the 20 years of building, the network, the intelligence, the Dragon Glass, the Night's Watch's restoration, when the managed succession crisis, the prevented war, had held together at the moment it needed to hold. Stannis' document remained sealed at Dragonstone. The conversation it required would come, eventually, in a world that had survived to have it. There were ways to address what it contained that did not require the realm to tear itself apart, and Joanna had been thinking about those ways since before the Long Night began. Tyrion sat on 2 small councils in the following decade and annoyed 3 kings, which she considered an accurate measure of the work he was doing. The wall stood. Winter passed, as winter always did, into spring.